The whole household had gathered to hear the season's gifts announced, and Silas Corvain opened with his favorite son, declaring Desmond's newly wakened talent for negotiation the pride of their entire line. Then he turned to Emery, and the warmth went out of his voice completely. "An eye for sorting scrap and rubble," he said, "was no gift worth the name, worthless, and loud enough to carry to the back wall." In the same breath, he named Desmond heir in Emery's place, stripped him of his name, his coin, and his standing before the assembled house, and ordered him onto the hollow road alone. Emery said nothing back. Whatever was supposed to sting in that moment, what actually rose in its place felt closer to relief. Some part of him had wanted out of this hall his whole life. Guards walked him past the gates without ceremony. No escort beyond the property line, no coin pressed into his hand for the road. Once the last rooftop of Cindermore fell behind him, Emery let himself smile for the first time all day. Whatever waited down the hollow road, it wasn't a life he'd ever asked for anyway. He hadn't gone half a mile before footsteps caught up to him fast. Petra, having slipped clean past the border stones, rather than stay behind in a house that had just discarded him. She swore, flatly and without asking permission, that her loyalty stood exactly where it always had, regardless of whatever House Corvain had just judged him worth. By late afternoon, the road had worn down to a windswept stretch of ruin, all cracked foundation stone and rotted timber scattered across open ground. Emery's senses caught the workable scrap buried under the rubble almost the instant they arrived. A whole layer of usable material nobody living out here had ever bothered to look for. He set to work at once, taking cracked stone and rotten timber in his hands and coaxing them, piece by piece, into standing walls. What rose out of the wreckage wasn't some hollow trick or an illusion that would collapse by morning. The walls held, square and solid and cold under his palms. Petra just stood there and stared, stunned that a sentence meant to kill him quietly had turned, in the space of one afternoon, into the beginning of something. Next, he found a collapsed cistern half choked with debris and refined its cracked stone, lining back into working order, seam by seam, until clean water finally rose and filled the repaired basin for the first time in years. Petra declared herself, right there, with wet hands and a straight face, Yieldrest's first founding member. No vote required, no one else around to object. With steady water finally at hand instead of whatever he'd been hauling in cupped palms, Emery's refining pace visibly quickened, one finished piece following the last without the long pauses of before. Weeks passed in steady, unglamorous labor. Emery cleared and tilled open ground day after day, refining a length of broken plow iron into a proper working blade, while Petra walked the furrows behind him, sowing the first rows of grain and root by hand. Somewhere in those weeks, without ever announcing it out loud, he committed himself fully to building a quiet life on this ground, rather than treating it as a stopover. His gift had its limits though, and they surprised him. Refining a tool was instant, but coaxing a seed into a crop was not. And for the first time since his gift had woken, he learned a patience the depot's swift labor back in Cindermore had never once demanded of him. Days later, the first green shoots broke through the tilled soil, and he found he was oddly proud of something he hadn't built with his hands at all. Far from the hollow road, House Vassar was finalizing an arranged match for their daughter Greta, a union meant to bind two fortunes without much concern for the bride's opinion of it. Greta refused the marriage to her family's face, plainly and without apology, and weathered the argument that followed without backing down an inch. That same night, rather than wait for the matter to be forced, she slipped away from the estate grounds alone, taking little more than a blade and whatever coin she could carry. Weeks passed as she wandered as a drifter with no fixed destination, trading blade work for meals along back roads that had mostly fallen out of use. A stranger she'd traded a morning's guard duty with, over a shared fire, mentioned in passing a settlement somewhere out past the hollow road that was said to turn no one away, no questions asked. With nothing left to lose and little enough to her name, Greta decided to try her luck there. She arrived at the edge of the settlement, just as a pack of wasteland dogs came storming out of the dusk at the fresh fence line. The new perimeter fence held the snarling pack back just long enough for Greta to draw steel and drop two of them herself. Quick, clean strikes that sent the rest of the pack scattering back into the dark. Emery came out to find the fence intact and credited her blade for Yieldrest's first clean win against anything. Petra and Greta fell to bickering almost immediately over who was standing closer to him when it mattered, a rivalry that would clearly outlast the dogs by a long stretch. Over the following days, Emery refined timber and stone into a proper house and furnished rooms with real beds and real doors, replaced the old lean-to shelter almost overnight. Petra and Greta both gaped at comforts neither of them had known in years. Then, in the same breath, both claimed the room nearest his own before the other could speak first. Greta, not to be outdone on her own terms, built herself an ice-chilled cellar down the hall, purely out of spite for the argument she'd just lost. Emery, worn thin from a full day's refining, ended up caught, exhausted, between two rival claims on his attention that showed no sign of resolving themselves. Months passed, and Yildiriz's stores kept climbing steadily until surplus grain began spilling past the cellar's original limits. Sacks stacked in doorways that were never meant to hold them. Petra repurposed her own gift into a second storage cistern line and lined a run of new cold vaults deep beneath the settlement without waiting to be asked. The overflow problem quietly resolved itself within days of her starting. Greta needled her the whole time about crowding what she still insisted was her own cellar's territory, and Emery mediated by praising both women's domestic contributions equally and at length, a strategy that satisfied precisely neither of them. A ragged column of refugees appeared on the road one gray morning, a man named Garner leading the starving group the last exhausted stretch toward Yildiriz's gates. Emery welcomed every single one of them through without hesitation or a single question asked about what they could offer in return. He refined a fresh run of pipe on the spot to widen the water supply for the sudden new mouths, while Petra and Greta ladled out the first hot meal most of the newcomers had eaten in longer than they wanted to say. The refugees ate until the pots ran completely dry and asked quietly if there might be more later. Garner thanked Emery personally and offered his hand in service on behalf of his whole group, and was folded in that same day as Yildiriz's newest resident leader. Word of it began to spread down the hollow road within the week that Yildiris, unlike everywhere else, turned no one away. Not long after, the goods refined tally rocketed past its first threshold, and something in Emery answered it. Ledger sense woke behind his eyes, a new and unmistakable feel for anyone approaching the settlement from any direction. The tally kept climbing and surged past a second threshold soon after, waking something sharper still, Honest Eye, which let him read a newcomer's hidden benchcraft at a glance, the way his old gift had always read scrap. Freshly refined lumber, drawn straight from the surge, raised an entire new row of housing before the sun had even finished setting that day. Over the following days, Emery made a habit of turning Honest Eye on every settler he passed, curious what the gift would turn up. A quiet laborer everyone had overlooked proved to have a master joiner's hands. A frightened widow who kept to herself showed an uncanny, almost eerie instinct for herbcraft. A boy barely old enough to carry a hammer had the steady grip of a future smith. One settler's calm under pressure singled him out at once to lead work crews, and another read weather and terrain better than any hired scout Emery had ever heard of. Every single reading confirmed the same quiet truth. Yildiriz's people were worth more than anyone, themselves included, had ever known to claim. Out of pure habit, half thinking, he turned the gift on Petra next, and it returned nothing at all, sliding straight off her without catching on anything. Whatever she carried refused outright to be read or measured by his gift. He admitted, a little sheepishly, that there was nothing he could do to force it out of hiding, and Petra, unbothered, resolved on the spot to draw it out through her own effort instead. Weeks passed, and the settlement's first true harvest finally came in. Yildiris held a communal feast in the central yard to mark it, long tables groaning under fresh bread, roasted grain, and preserved stores from the cellar. An independent band of travelers, drawn by the smoke and noise, wandered straight into the middle of the feast uninvited, and Emery waved them to an open table without a second thought or a word of complaint. A far larger second wave followed within days of the first, pushing the population hard toward its next threshold. Emery accepted every single one of them without exception, same as always. Garner and his old friend Palmer, freshly arrived himself, scrambled together to register the swelling rolls before anyone got lost in the count, while Petra and Greta worked the crowd helping settle whole families onto open ground before nightfall. Yildiriz's numbers swelled faster that week than anyone at all had planned for. The population finally crossed its next great threshold, and Yildiriz's whole scale visibly doubled almost overnight, streets and roof lines multiplying faster than anyone could quite track. Emery refined stone into the polished floor of a brand new ringed assay circle at the settlement's heart, while doubled housing rows rose in the same surge along the depot's rapidly expanding edge, opening fresh civic space for trade and defense alike. That evening, once the crowds had thinned, Petra climbed onto the finished assay circle alone, drawn there by something she couldn't quite explain to herself. Weeks of her own quiet, private effort finally came to a point standing on those stones. Her true measure woke at last, earned through her own patience, rather than simply granted by the ground beneath her. The first thing it showed her was Emery's own worth, read back to him plainly, and she stood there stunned by exactly how much the gift found in him. Settlers nearby, who caught only a glimpse of the moment, began murmuring, quietly at first, that he was something more than lucky, and whispers of a chosen, legendary founder started spreading on past his notice entirely. Whole seasons passed as Greta took the settlement's defense firmly in hand, drilling volunteer after volunteer into real fighters. She ran the watch through blade work and formation every single morning without fail, until even the growing children underfoot started picking up her same disciplined stance without being taught it directly. More settlers, tested by honest eye along the way, turned out to carry small hidden gifts of their own, and that steady drilling combined with Emery's readings sharpened the whole watch considerably. Hunting parties, better armed and better trained than before, began bringing down far tougher game than anyone had dared hunt previously, and the perimeter grew visibly harder to threaten with every passing week. A settler named Roswell surfaced a rare defensive gift during one of Greta's drills and swore, with a seriousness that startled everyone nearby, to personally shield Emery from any harm that came looking for him. Tam, meanwhile, earned his own respected place among the watch through nothing but raw, undeniable talent. Rumors of a chosen founder kept circulating quietly among the newer arrivals, growing a little each time they were retold. But Emery brushed the talk off entirely, too busy hunched over his bench to notice how far Yieldrest's reputation had already outpaced its own founder's awareness of it. A frightened new group arrived at the gates one evening, warning of raiders working the hollow road not far behind them, a slaving band, by their account, moving from settlement to settlement. Emery doubled the watch along the outer perimeter that same night, and before long, ledger sense prickled sharply at an unfamiliar presence lingering just past the fence line. Roswell and the watch cornered the lone scout in the dark and had him bound before he could raise so much as a single word of alarm. Emery ordered him held rather than questioned or harmed in any way, and the scout was walked straight to a holding tent under quiet guard, where he gave up nothing, and nothing at all was asked of him in return. Yieldrest, sensing what was coming, quietly braced itself for whatever came looking for him next. Night fell, and the raider force finally moved on Yieldrest in earnest, hitting the crate wall barricade squarely at what they clearly believed was its weakest point. Roswell's readied line absorbed the full charge without breaking a single step, while Greta's watch countered hard along the flank in tight, drilled formation. The raiders' advance stalled completely against the settlement's standing defenses, their line cracking apart and scattering out into the dark fields beyond the fence. Defenders ran down the fleeing stragglers along the open perimeter, Greta closing the distance on one in a few brisk moves and disarming him before he could even turn to run properly. The rest of the shattered band simply dropped their weapons where they stood and surrendered outright. No further fight left in any of them. By first light, every last raider stood bound and entirely unhurt, and Emery, watching it all from atop the wall, noticed almost idly that the goods refined tally had kept right on climbing the whole way through the fight. Dawn broke fully over Yieldrest's yard as the last of the raiders folded under Roswell's ward, and from the granary loft, Emery watched every remaining knee in the yard hit the dirt at once. The instant the final blade fell, Roswell's ward dropped from around the captives like a held breath let go. Wick, the turned scout still catching his wind by the gate, admitted flatly that the false caravan report the raiders had chased all night had been his own idea, planted to buy Yieldrest the extra hours it needed. Emery remembered then that it was Attili's earlier questioning of that same scout, days before, that had seeded the whole trap from the start. The raiders, it turned out, had spent the night hunting a shipment that had never once left the depot floor. A locked cage bolted to one of their wagons yielded nearly 30 chained captives, thin, shivering, and blinking against the light, like none of them quite believed it yet. By dusk, the gate tally had climbed past 160 hands, the highest count Yieldrest had ever logged. Garner proposed folding the newly freed captives straight into the workforce, rather than leaving them to sit idle and stew on what had been done to them, and Emery agreed before Garner had even finished the sentence. The reformed hands were standing at the refining benches by that same afternoon, sleeves rolled, still thin, but working steadily. Word of Yieldrest's honest measure kept spreading faster than either man expected, carried down the hollow road by every trader who passed through and left satisfied, and within the week, the goods tally rocketed clean past 18,000. True yield surged again in answer to it. The depot's bizarre hall unlocked overnight, its stalls framed up before the crews had even finished celebrating, bringing with it standing order to organize refining work across dozens of hands at once, and proxy trading, ready for its first real use. Crews stacked a second layer onto the crate wall perimeter through the morning, bracing it thick enough to stop a battering charge, dust and splinters drifting off every fresh cut. New corner platforms rose at each turn for the reformed watch to stand their shifts on, high enough now to see the whole stretch of road beyond the gate. Emery framed his own quarters up a full second story above the old workshop floor, and the salvaged timber refined into wide plank flooring with enough left over that he stacked the surplus against the wall for later, already half planning what it would become. That first night, he sat alone up there, oddly startled by how much room he suddenly had to himself after months of shared floor space. The new wash house opened at last, fed by the repaired cistern lines, and steam rolled off refined copper boilers for Yildrest's very first hot bath. Morning and evening bathing slots sparked a genuinely heated scheduling argument within a day, loud enough to draw a crowd of its own. Residents drafted their own rotation chart to settle it, without bothering to ask Emery at all. He tested the boiler himself first, out of simple curiosity, and yelped loud enough that the whole yard heard it. The laughter followed him for days after. By the next morning, someone had already nailed a hand-lettered sign to the door reading Boylefoot's bathhouse. Ladders and catwalks went up along the inside of the wall through the week, and narrow loopholes were chiseled through the crate barricade for bow use, giving the watch clean lines down the whole approach. Roswell counted through the armory stock personally, tallying blade by blade on his fingers, and found barely enough usable steel to arm a fraction of the watch standing ready. A patched-together sword pried loose from the back of storage was handed over for testing, and it snapped clean at the hilt on the very first swing, brittle straight through, confirming what Roswell had already feared. The first fully processed cohort was marched back in soon after, hollow-eyed and thin from whatever road had brought them there, and Ottilie took them aside herself before they'd even set down their bundles, assigning each one a real purpose inside the settlement. Emery sourced scrap iron and river ore in bulk, and refined it straight into finished blades, and the forge crew turned out weapon after weapon faster than anyone had planned for. Production had to scale up twice in a single stretch before demand was finally satisfied. Even with real steel finally in hand, the newly armed ranks still hesitated, plainly, to carry it out toward an actual fight. Cobb, newly reformed and still finding his footing among honest work, murmured a suggestion meant to slip past notice, angling a ledger token toward the scale in a way that wasn't quite honest. The token rang false the moment Emery's gift touched it, its true weight nothing like its claimed one. Caught outright, Cobb was walked straight back to Ottilie for another round of correction. Petra and Greta were shown their own new adjoining rooms that evening, with some ceremony. Both had already planted themselves at his own work table, arguing over which of them had the better claim to the chair nearest his, before he had so much as made it up the stairs himself. Weeks slid by while the depot's rhythm settled into a steady, almost unremarkable routine, the kind Emery had never once expected to have. Then one evening, a scouting party missed its expected return as the light faded and worry spread quietly through the yard, hand to hand, as full dark finally closed in over the walls with no sign of them on the road. Torches finally appeared on the road, the returning party dragging something enormous behind them through the dark. Tam had the whole carcass slung over one shoulder, alone, carrying it like it weighed nothing at all. Emery declared a feast on the spot, right there at the gate, before the party had even finished walking it in. Long tables filled the yard within the hour, smoke rising thick off the spitfires as the carcass turned over the flames. Word came in alongside the feast that Palmer's garden beds had swollen roots the size of 2 fists apiece, bigger than anything the soil out here had grown before. Greta layered a fresh coat of frost over the surplus meat already piling up in her cellar, enough now to see the settlement through the coming season without rationing. Wick asked leave, almost shyly, to send word for the kin he'd left behind at his old camp, and Emery agreed before the man had even finished asking, waving off the thanks that followed. 2 of the reformed stepped forward on their own, unprompted, to volunteer for wall duty that same night, standing shifts they'd never have been trusted with a month before. Watching it all settle around him, Emery marveled quietly at how far this yard had come since the lean-to he and Petra had first raised alone. Several days on, the scouting team came back down the hollow road at last, bringing Wick's kin with them, alongside a fresh column of refugees and a line of bound captives trailing behind. The already reformed hands took the newest arrivals straight under their own wing without needing to be told twice. 2 travelers, Wendell and Elsie, stopped dead in the road at the sheer height of the crate wall alone. They described punishing new levies crushing their home settlements to the east, taxes stacked until nothing was left standing over from a harvest. Emery told them plainly what had put him out here in the first place, a father who had named his gift worthless in front of an entire house and exiled him for it. Silas Corvain's name still caught in his throat, even years later on the way out. He offered Wendell's whole community open passage to Yildiz before either of them thought to ask for it. A second hunting party returned soon after, dragging something far larger still behind them, and Wendell and Elsie went pale at the sight of its tusked shape crossing the gate. Tam and Greta wrestled the ridgeback boar into the yard together, hauling it hand over hand, and it was down and bound before either newcomer could finish flinching. Elsie admitted, half laughing at herself, that she had never once seen anything handled that easily before. Wendell's entire home community arrived not long after in one long wagon column, wheels rutting the road for a mile behind them, and dust hanging over the whole procession. Standing Order marshaled 100 hands to raise housing on the spot, crews swarming the framing in coordinated waves, and pre-cut wall panels, already refined and racked ahead of time, snapped into a full new row within hours. More families straggled in behind them still, fleeing the same tax collectors that had emptied Wendell's home. Each new arrival folded in with less ceremony than the last. Cobb and Wick, by then, stood full watch shifts beside the old guard without a soul questioning it anymore. Wick answered to no one now but Ottilie, and Cobb whistled cheerfully through his third straight week of latrine duty, as if it didn't bother him in the least, the whole yard teasing him for it good-naturedly. The staff count and the goods tally both blew past their next mark together that same stretch. 150,000 goods refined, staff climbing past 6,000 strong, numbers that would have sounded like fantasy back on the day he'd first walked the Hollow Road. The Fairground District tore itself open in answer, unlocking waybill and barricade reflex both at once, and entirely new categories of buildings bloomed across the settlement's plans, practically overnight, more than the crews could even name yet. A young orchard went into the ground along the settlement's south slope, rows of saplings staked and watered by evening. That same evening, Emery soaked in the new bathhouse with Petra and Greta, the old argument over bathing slots long since forgotten between the three of them. Meanwhile, back in Cindermore, Duke Passmore noticed his own tax rolls thinning far faster than any bad harvest could account for. He rode out into the Hollow Reach himself to see it firsthand, taking Holt, his best guard, along for the look. Cobb's far-spoken voice cut through Emery's calm without warning, sharp and close as if the man were standing right beside him. A Duke's column, he warned, had just reached Yildrest's outer gate. Duke Passmore and Holt rode up to walls taller than either man had clearly expected to find out here. Frost coated the fields beyond the gate, and yet Yildrest's own crops stood green straight through it, untouched by the cold. Every home they passed on the way in looked warm, dry, and solidly built, nothing like the frontier they'd braced for. Emery came out to meet them himself at the gate, rather than sending a steward in his place. He laid it out plainly, the gift his own father had once called worthless in front of a full house. Silas Corvain, he said, had disowned him over it at a public appraisal years back. That same worthless gift, it turned out, was the thing shaping this entire settlement now. A welcome feast went out that evening, with dishes neither guest recognized, and Holt eyed the unfamiliar spread warily before working his way through 3 full plates anyway. After the meal, the watch ran a short defensive drill for the visitors' benefit, and Greta downed 3 sparring partners in a row before Holt had finished blinking twice. Roswell's ward, Tam's raw strength, Cobb's far speech. It became plain, watching the drill, that nearly every hand in Yildrest carried some gift of its own. Holt admitted flatly, no longer trying to hide it, that his own elite guard wouldn't survive one pass through this place. Passmore murmured, half to himself, that the Concord would raze Yildrest to the ground the moment word of it ever got out. Emery lingered unseen near the guest quarters after the feast broke up, and overheard Passmore resolve, quietly and to himself, to bury the report entirely, rather than send it up the chain to anyone above him. Morning brought a runner with a plea from the Grafen settlements to the north. Half frozen from the ride, word was their stores had failed outright as the season turned harder than expected. Emery turned down the easy answer of simply shipping crates north to cover the gap, and decided on something bigger instead, ordering survey crews to lay a proper supply road all the way to Grafen, so the relief would never have to stop at one delivery. Days later, a separate scouting party returned from the wilderness beyond the road, having folded in along the way a stranded family that no one had expected to find alive out there. A modest wagon rolled through Yildrest's gate, carrying 2 travelers dressed plain enough to pass for anyone's cousins, though the woman gave only the name Isolde and her broad-shouldered companion only Danai. before Garner could so much as ask their business. Isolde pressed a sealed case of restorative salves into his hands, calling it a gift between honest traders and nothing more. Behind them, the rest of their small retinue simply stopped walking altogether. Necks craned back at the Fairground District's rooftops, stacked 3 deep against the sky, the kind of skyline nobody expected to find, waiting at the end of a frontier road. Garner only thanked her for the salves and asked whether they'd eaten yet, as though a stranger's stunned silence over a rooftop line was just another normal Tuesday around here. They settled in for 12 unhurried days, and Isolde used every one of them touring the bazaar hall's stalls, running lengths of cured leather between her fingers at table after table. At one counter, she very nearly hailed the young trader running it as Emery himself. So exactly did he mirror his face, his stance, even the way he weighed a scale. A clipped vowel on a common word and an unfamiliar squint gave the deception away before his name ever left her mouth. Later, soaking her feet by the fountain, Danai murmured that Yildress trained deputy traders to be truly identical to their lead by design, not by accident, and that the whole depot likely ran on a dozen faces nobody outside its walls had ever counted. Isolde said nothing to that, only counted the stalls stretching away in every direction, shelf after shelf, stocked floor to ceiling, with goods bearing not one flaw she could find. That evening, Isolde and Danai soaked in the washhouse's cedar tubs, steam curling off water hot enough to embarrass any noble bath back home. Somewhere past the changing screens, Petra and Greta were bickering again, each one insisting she alone should be the one to walk the visiting traders through the young South Slope orchard come morning, neither willing to yield the errand to the other. Isolde admitted quietly that no border keep back home had ever managed water this consistently hot. The next afternoon, Isolde haggled cask prices with Garner over pressed cider and dried orchard fruit, and lost the exchange on purpose, drawing the conversation out far longer than the sale itself was worth, content to trade coin for whatever else slipped out of him along the way. By the 12th day, their escort was repacking the wagons for the road, crates of salves and cured leather lashed down alongside everything else they'd bought, the whole visit closing as quietly and unremarkably as it had begun. Days later, Trader Corwin Dade's caravan rolled up the hollow road, and he said plainly, more than once, that he'd never expected a settlement this size to be thriving out here at all, not with the hollow reach on one side and empty frontier on every other. His people traded southern cloth and spice for crates of orchard fruit, and before he moved on, Corwin sold off an entire herd of goats and cattle, rather than drive them any farther on tired legs. Finch, a quiet young herd reader nobody had assigned the job to, simply stepped in and took charge of the animals, murmuring them calm through the gate without ever raising a hand or a switch. Within the hour, the goats were grazing the south paddock like they had lived there their whole lives, and by evening, nobody could remember whose herd they'd started out as. Word reached Yildress that raiders had breached the Grafen settlement's fence line. Hundreds of them tore across the frost flats, torching granaries and grain stores as they came, smoke rolling black against the failing light. Elder Marin ordered her people to scatter north, though not a ridge or a tree line stood anywhere along the way to shield the fleeing column, whole families running with nothing but what they'd grabbed on the way out the door. She sent her young runner, Corin, sprinting ahead of everyone else, alone, to beg Yildress for whatever help it could send in time. Emery spotted the chase from the half-graded road site long before Corin ever reached him, a dark smear of riders closing on a slower, ragged line of walkers. One look at the gap between them told him help arriving on foot would be too late to matter. He had the road crews overturn crated stock wagons straight across the raiders' path. Wagon after wagon dragged sideways and dropped, then stack-sealed casks in a second layer atop the toppled line. The horde hit the sudden wall of crates and casks at a dead run, with nowhere left to swerve and no time to try. Defenders funneled the horde into the narrow gap between the crate wagon barriers, while watch archers volleyed down into the packed mass below, arrow after arrow finding nowhere else to land. Pell called formation as the trapped raiders milled with nowhere left to run. Tam and the road crews cut the lashings on the stacked casks, and a wall of loaded barrels avalanched straight down onto the riders beneath. Within a quarter hour, the packed mass had simply stopped moving. Defenders opened one narrow gap for the last raider still standing, and Garner directed crews binding the rest of them in hauling chains. Tam alone dragged 3 stunned raiders through the gap like sacks of grain. The Grafen families, Elder Marin among them, watched the entire horde fall without Yildrest losing a single person. Maren could not find a single word for what she had just watched happen. Greta admitted, almost sheepish about it, that she had never once seen a battle won without blood, not in all her years training under House Vassar's own masters. Then, War Chief Harker crested the ridge, having missed the trap entirely, and stood a full head over every raider already bound in the pen below him, a build made for cracking shields, rather than swinging around them. He bowled straight through the mop-up line toward the wagons and smashed clean through the toppled barrier as though it were kindling and nothing more. The road crew's spare crates and casks had run dry by then, and Emery had nothing left on hand to throw into his path. Roswell's shield line locked in to catch the next swing, while Tam and Pell drove pry bars into the backs of the war chief's knees. Watch archers switched to heavier war shafts, but Harker only dragged the whole shield line backward across the ground by raw strength alone. A relay wagon rolled in from Yildrest just then, loaded with fresh stock, and defenders stacked the new crates into a leaning wall directly over him. Roswell and Tam hauled the wall's brace free together, and the stacked crates came down all at once and buried Harker whole, crushing the fight out of him for good and leaving the field entirely quiet behind him. Bonfires lit a settlement-wide celebration of the Horde's defeat before the night was through. Spits of roasted meat and pressed cider passed hand to hand between people who'd been strangers only a season earlier. Emery moved through the crowd, sealing wounds on Yildrest folk and Grafen refugees alike, one gash and one bruise at a time. Bound Sub-Commander Rourke was brought before him, terrified, and admitted that Harker had pressed every one of his raiders into the attack under threat of the lash, with no choice any of them had been given. Rather than sentence him, Emery pulled Rourke onto the bench beside him instead. Word spread through the firelight fast that 300 forced conscripts would not be punished for a fight none of them had chosen. Emery offered the whole group open shelter for the season, and before the bonfires burned low, he had already raised a full row of housing from stacked timber stock, roofs going up, while the last of the ash still glowed. Days later, Emery and Greta rode out to Marin's ruined settlement together. Burned granaries and stripped cellars still stood exactly as the raiders had left them, untouched since the attack. Emery resolved on the spot to link the two settlements permanently, rather than leave Grafen isolated out here again. He claimed a wide stretch of ground between them and poured 3 full days of banked stone into a proper stairway, steps rising course by course under his hands until they cleared the last ridge. A roofed corridor rose to connect Yildrest to Grafen ground directly, wide enough to walk 2 abreast and dry underfoot in any weather. Marin walked its length awed, quietly wishing, not for the first time, that the man would learn to slow down. Far south, Renata Ashgrove watched condemned thieves march into her fighting ring and dropped all 4 of them before a single blow ever landed. A lieutenant reported rumors drifting up from the north of some cheap, honest trade settlement gaining ground where no settlement had any business surviving. Renata laughed the story off, still stung over Wick's desertion from her own ranks, and ordered a harder push on the region the moment the roads thawed, unwilling to believe an honest settlement could outlast a single hard season. Deep winter settled over the region for weeks without Yildrest so much as noticing the cold. Emery topped off the cisterns and cold cellars twice every week without fail. He kept the washhouse furnace and the hall's floor grates running warm straight through the worst of it, so that even the coldest storm outside meant nothing more than steam on the windows within. Rourke's conscripts spent the season learning honest trades instead of shivering through it like every winter before, hands going from raiding to weaving and forging without complaint, and morale climbed higher than Garner had ever once recorded it. When the thaw finally broke, Grafen's granaries and fence line stood rebuilt from the ground up. Marin thanked Emery formally for the corridor and the season of shelter, then announced it was time for her people to move back home at last. Almost no one stepped forward to go with her. Fewer than a dozen of the 300 wanted to return at all. Her own daughter told her, gently, that she had already apprenticed into the bazaar hall and had no intention of leaving warm floors and full shelves for a rebuilt fence line and another hard winter. Marin waited alone at the mouth of the corridor for a column that never formed behind her. Eventually, she admitted defeat and asked quietly to stay at Yildrest permanently herself. Garner logged the last of the Grafen households into Yildrest's rolls that same afternoon. A gaunt column came down off the high passes not long after, its spokesman Harlan keeping one hand near his hammer the whole way in. He explained that a burrowing horror had collapsed their deep galleries and driven every last miner out with nothing but what they could carry. Emery welcomed them through the gate slowly, careful not to rush people already unsteady on open ground. The miners flinched, crossing the bizarre hall's wide-open floor, unused to so much sky pressing down over their heads after a lifetime spent under stone. He housed them in the walled inner district instead, narrow lanes and low roofs standing in for the tunnels they'd lost, and inside its tighter, closer streets, they finally began to relax. Garner spread out roasted vegetables and orchard cider for the new arrivals that evening. Harlan's guards swapped increasingly exaggerated cave-in survival stories over their drinks, each telling taller than the last until the tunnels in the retelling had collapsed a dozen different ways, and the whole guarded column laughed louder than anyone had expected out of them. Emery had Palmer set aside a standing store of supplies for whichever arrivals came next, because by now there was always a next. In the days that followed, Emery ran every new arrival through Honest Eye at his bench. Most of the miners showed plain, solid, underground-honed competence, and little more. One of them, a woman named Kelder, took a cracked pick head off the bench, worked the heat into it until the metal ran true, and reforged it into a blade sharper than anything already racked in the depot. Emery judged her on the spot, the rarest weapon crafting hand he had found yet. That night, he hauled raw quarry stone out to the drill himself, one slab after another dragged into place by lantern light. He refined block after block long past sundown, pushing straight through the ache that used to mean stop, and then straight past that too, sweat-soaked and swaying on his feet. Well past midnight, spent past standing, Roswell carried his collapsed body back inside without a word of complaint. By morning, Soren reported strange ground out past the paddocks, something in the soil that didn't sit right with him, even though he couldn't say exactly why. Emery sent word to Quillen, a wandering salvager who had recently taken on a small crew of his own, and asked him to scout it out before anything else out there had the chance to go wrong. Corin cornered Quillen before the wagons even finished loading, begging to be taken back out to the strange stretch of ground east of the settlement that everyone had started whispering about. Quillen didn't so much as slow down. He told him flatly to stay put at Yieldrest and stop asking. Elsie, hauling sacks onto her supply cart a few paces off, caught his crestfallen face and offered, low and amused, to smuggle him along buried under the grain instead. He took her up on it before she'd even finished the sentence, wriggling down between the sacks and going still. The scouting party rolled out at dawn without anyone the wiser. Corin lay cramped and rigid under the sacks for the first 2 hours, barely daring to breathe. Then the wagon jolted hard over a stretch of cracked stone, stirring up dust that had settled for years undisturbed, and he sneezed so violently there was no pretending he wasn't there. Rather than turn the wagon around, Quillen simply marched him forward with the rest of the crew, muttering that he'd deal with him later. They hadn't gone much farther when a rust-hided scrapstalker lunged out of a collapsed archway, all teeth and scavenged plating. Roswell had a portable alloy snare cage snapped around its legs before it landed its charge, and Greta finished it with a single clean elemental charge strike that dropped it where it stood. The party barely broke stride, stepping around the carcass like it was nothing new. Emery reached the vault mouth with Petra at his side, meeting Quillen's crew right where the ruined stonework gave way to open dark. A freshly posted working notice named the site for what it truly was: bedrock right, the power to refine the raw ground itself. Emery told the crew plainly that he meant to carve safe waypoints deep into the hostile stone ahead of them, so no one had to feel their way through blind. He and Petra slipped ahead of the main party alone, leaving the others to follow at a safer pace. Kneeling by a shattered slab, he refined it from ruin into solid, claimed ground, and felt the anchor point settle under his will the instant it finished. Bedrock Right let him raise more of them wherever he chose, each one a small foothold he now owned outright. From a heap of loosened rubble, he assembled a ward sentry, blocky and patient, and sent it forward to scout while he guided it from a careful distance. Soren's danger sense prickled at every side passage they passed, a low, itching wrongness he couldn't quite name. Rasp threaded the crumbling corridors by pure instinct, never once doubling back, while Elowen walked a half step slower, listening for the mood of things unseen in the dark around them. It was Soren who flagged it first, a pressure-set trigger hidden beneath a patch of loose gravel, innocent-looking enough to have killed someone careless. Rather than risk a person on it, Emery sent his rubble sentry ahead along the flagged path, and it dutifully tripped a dart trap built for living legs, taking the volley meant for flesh without so much as a groan. A tusked scrap boar came next, charging out of a side vault with its head lowered. Roswell's bastion ward snapped up in time to absorb the full weight of the hit, and the stunned creature reeled, legs buckling under it before it could recover. Greta drove an ice-crusted blade through its exposed flank a heartbeat later, and just like that, no one on the crew had taken so much as a scratch. The vent behind them chose that moment to empty out a chittering swarm of rust mites. Quillen barked for cover, and the crew flipped their supply crates into a makeshift barricade wall almost before he'd finished the order, Corin ducking low behind Roswell's raised bastion ward for good measure. Greta scorched a wide arc through the swarm's front ranks, thinning it fast, and the rubble sentry mopped up the stragglers underfoot until the vent finally, blessedly, fell silent. 3 husk sentinels rose from the floor ahead, animated corroded husks guarding a sealed archway, like they'd been waiting decades for someone foolish enough to try it. Emery raised a heavier rubble construct on the spot, built for exactly this kind of fight, and it pinned and dismantled all 3 in short order without the crew so much as flinching. Behind the archway sat an ornate, gem-studded ceremonial coffer, promising treasure worth the trouble, and inside it, once cracked open, sat one dull, fist-sized lump of pitted raw ore. Nobody said what they were all thinking. Quillen grumbled that brute-forcing sealed chambers open wasn't worth the risk, not with old salvager talk still fresh in his head about unseen wardens ruling sites exactly like this one. He'd barely finished saying it when Rasp spotted the shortcut for what it was, a floor tile rigged to give way the instant anyone trusted it. Rather than argue the point, Emery simply refined a proper stone bridge straight across the gap, solid and unhurried, and the whole party crossed without incident, the trap left behind, harmless and unsprung. The corridor finally opened onto a chamber of dead, dark vaults, and a tiny lavender-haired spirit flickered into view above the dust, trembling so hard her glow stuttered. Nib warned them back in a small, frightened voice, more startled than hostile. Emery lowered his hands slowly and told her plainly that they meant no harm, and after a long moment, her glow steadied, wary still, but no longer fleeing toward the shadows. She explained, haltingly, that she needed vault points to open her sealed bands, debts she'd been unable to settle alone for longer than she cared to say. Emery offered her something simpler than magic, steady excavation and honest trade, freely given. Nib called it the fairest offer she'd heard in longer than she could remember, and accepted on the spot, her tiny hand all but disappearing inside his when they shook on it. The chamber was named an official yield-rest way station before the dust had even settled, the buried exchange from that moment forward, and a waybill marker was planted at its entrance like a flag. Quillen's crew was assigned as its standing garrison, and word of the newly sanctioned vault had spread clear through Yieldrest before nightfall. Yieldrest's staff tally climbed past 10,000 hands that same season, a number that would have sounded absurd to anyone who remembered the roadside stall it started as. The Fairground District's growth notice unlocked multi-story blocks the instant the count crossed, and Garner's crews broke ground on the settlement's first covered market colonnade before the notice had even finished settling into place. Tam finished a raised timber slide beside the wash house, grinning like it was the finest thing he'd ever built, and took one triumphant test run down it himself before anyone could stop him. He wasn't even back on his feet before a pack of children had swarmed the thing, shrieking with delight, and claimed it as their own. A new notice unlocked full reckoning, a gift that could read the full extent of a person's holdings, debts, savings, secrets, and all at a glance. Curious and not thinking it through, Emery tried it on an unsuspecting Garner standing nearby. It surfaced his debts, his modest savings, and a secret courtship he'd told absolutely no one about. Garner went scarlet on the spot, demanding to know exactly how Emery could possibly have found out. Thoroughly mortified, Emery swore then and there to use the gift only in true emergencies from then on. Petra led Emery, blindfolded and mildly suspicious, toward the market square, and the cloth came off to reveal a banner-strung crowd thousands deep, all of them cheering before he'd even finished blinking. Garner boomed out a speech crediting him with founding Yieldrest single-handed, and then, warming to the moment, claimed Emery had once refined an entire caravan bare-handed overnight. Emery had never said any such thing in his life, and the crowd cheered louder anyway. A cluster of children pressed a crown woven from scrap wire and cloth into his hands, beaming up at him. Roswell added, entirely unhelpfully, that Emery had personally leveled the whole of the hollow road for their benefit. His face burned redder with every embellished claim piled on top of the last, until he finally muttered, half to himself, that he'd only wanted a quiet supper, not a parade. A massive scrap-plated serpent surfaced just past the outer wall, and watchers scattered in every direction, certain the settlement was finally under attack. Roswell raised his shield and ordered the gate crews to hold their ground rather than bolt. The Serpent, for its part, ignored the barricades completely and nosed straight toward a depot rack, pressing its snout against a row of honestly refined ingots with the calm of something that had simply come home. Alaoin read its mood in an instant. Curiosity, not hunger, not malice. Emery approached slowly and let it sniff his open palm, and in return, it nudged forward a rare vein of unrefined ore like an offering. It coiled itself near the depot gate afterward and stayed, apparently content to spend the rest of its days as Yildrest's newest, largest hauler. 4 road-worn wanderers arrived asking after the vault's founder, and were plainly stunned to find him a mild, unassuming young man, rather than whatever they'd pictured. Percy, Doss, Ember, and Lance introduced themselves as freelance excavators looking for steady work, and Emery welcomed them without hesitation, offering them a place at the Buried Exchange. Below, Nib opened a second band deeper into the vault as her points kept climbing, though a private low-hazard route stayed reserved strictly for Emery's own use. The upper bands, by design, stayed gentle enough for the greenest of newcomers. A caravan of traveling artisans led by Astra reached the gates not long after, and her people were just as startled to find the founder this soft-spoken and young. Astra herself couldn't quite believe a live, working vault sat calmly beside ordinary houses like it was nothing remarkable. Garner toured the whole group through the guest lodge built for exactly this kind of visitor, and they sampled cured meats and dyed cloth, priced so fairly it bordered on suspicious. Astra's skepticism melted away over the course of a single afternoon, and by evening, her entire caravan had decided, on the spot, to make camp permanent. Emery offered Astra's band a turn on the assay circle for the price of a single coin, quietly reading each of their true trade gifts with honest eye as they stepped forward one by one. He introduced Petra next, and her own gift confirmed every reading he'd given, down to the last one. 3 months slipped by while Holloway toured Corvain's distant holdings, quietly burying every true report on Yildrest's growth the entire way he'd been doing for longer than his own conscience liked. He and Guard Captain Hendrik finally turned back toward it, expecting to find the same modest hamlet he'd left behind. What greeted them instead was a sprawling district that hadn't existed, by any honest account, the last time he'd looked. Hendrik stared, entirely speechless, at row after row of gleaming refined arms, admitting flatly that he'd never in his life seen tempered steel this consistent. Holloway inspected a rack of alloy blades with visibly unsteady hands, turning one over as though it might explain itself. By the time he set it down, he'd already resolved, quietly, to keep concealing Yildrest's true scale a while longer. Harlan's miners and Marin's settlers traded stalls side by side now, as though they'd always belonged there, with underhold tools and Grafen preserves changing hands daily and openly. Emery and Nib, meanwhile, had settled into an easy, familiar friendship that neither of them made a fuss about. A dedicated forge hall rose for Kelder, so she could hone her rare craft properly at last, and word of it all drew a steadily growing traffic of treasure seekers to the vault gates. Below them, Nib opened a third band deeper still, the whole domain widening once again. Emery kept quietly testing newcomers as they filtered through, rewarding the promising ones with better work and better tools, without ever making a show of it. Yildrest's gear stayed absurdly cheap despite its uncut quality, a contradiction that only seemed to draw more people in. By the time the season turned, the staff tally had crossed 14,000. 2 more weeks slipped by before a lone rider finally reached the gates, a House Corvain emissary requesting a private audience with Emery. He brought word that Desmond's militia had crushed a rival holding along the Hollow Road, and that Desmond now ruled the conquered ground, hailed on all sides as its conqueror. The emissary made no secret of it. Yildrest's rise, he warned, read as a threat back home. Emery insisted, evenly, that he wanted nothing but peace. Petra, standing quietly beside him, did not look convinced. Back at House Vassar, Cassian fretted he'd be passed over as heir now that his sister's flight had dragged the family name through the mud. Lord Bertrand brooded over her long silence, pacing the same stretch of floor night after night. 4 separate waves of messengers had already gone to fetch her and never returned. When a 5th wave went and simply vanished too, they'd defected straight into Yildrest's watch the moment they saw the place. His fury finally boiled over. He stopped sending strangers and sent his own elder son, Rennick, to finish it himself. Rennick rode the Hollow Road alone. House Vassar's best blade and battle mage rolled into one man, confident this would take take an afternoon. The closer he got, the less he liked what he saw. Ramparts, orchards heavy with fruit on land that should have been dead dirt, smoke from a dozen busy chimneys instead of one lonely fire. This wasn't the desperate refugee camp the rumors back home had described at all. Watch sentries fell in around him and walked him past packed stalls and busy workshops, letting him see exactly how much there was to see on the way in. Emery met him there himself, calm, unarmed, hands open at his sides. Greta stepped up beside him, arms crossed, already finished with the conversation before it started. She told her brother flatly she wasn't going home to marry a stranger their father had picked for her. Humiliated in front of a watching crowd, Rennick ordered his guard escort to seize her by force. It went badly for him fast. Roswell's shield line took the charge head on and folded it flat in seconds, planted like the guards had run into a wall that hit back. Pell put two more on the ground with a single shield bash combo before either man had drawn a proper breath. The rest of the elite escort lay groaning in the trampled grass. Rennick stared at the wreckage of his own guard, stunned at how badly he'd misjudged this place, then drew steel anyway and challenged Greta himself. Her elemental charged blade answered with fire, and wind laced through every strike, and it ended in 4 exchanges flat. He dropped his sword and knelt in the churned up grass, beaten in front of his own house's colors. Emery had the healer's 10 guards and kin alike. No distinction made between the men who'd attacked and the men who'd stopped them. A healer named Bryn knelt to stitch the split above Rennick's eyebrow, gentle and businesslike about it, and the great warrior who'd just lost to his own sister went crimson under her hands and fainted dead away in front of everyone. When he finally came around, mortified, the first thing he did was send word home that he wasn't coming back. Not to House Vassar, not for any arranged match, not ever. Desmond's temper kept curdling as more stories of a booming city up the road reached him, a city outpacing his own hard-won conquest without spilling a drop of blood to do it. He couldn't stand not knowing how, so he picked 6 of his most trusted men and sent them to scout Yildrest's walls quietly, on his own authority, no one else told. The scouting team crept toward the district under cover of dusk, moving low and quiet through the brush the way trained soldiers do. Ledger sense flagged every one of them anyway, before they'd even cleared the tree line. Roswell's watch sprang a rope and net ambush from the branches above, and all 6 men, who'd expected to vanish into shadow, instead found themselves hanging bound in moments, feet off the ground. They were marched straight before Ottilie. Her flat stare alone had their leader, Draven, talking inside a minute. He confirmed Desmond had ordered the whole thing personally, no one else involved. A nervous trader calling himself Fenner drifted through the bazaar hall, watching more than buying, his ledger books far too fine for his shabby travel gear. Emery noticed and walked over himself instead of sending a guard, then escorted him straight to Ottilia's post, braced for the worst. Fenner recognized the interrogator by reputation alone and broke inside a single minute. No threats required. He confessed he was Desmond's paid informant, sent to quietly count Yildrest's stores shelf by shelf, and he admitted, almost apologetically, that Desmond's obsession with the city's unchecked growth had curdled into something close to mania back home. Rather than punish him for it, Emery had him resettled among the reformed captives instead, the same offer everyone else got. Fenner got a bunk in the housing block, and Rourke, the freed conscript leader, welcomed him over a shared meal, telling him flat out that life under Emery beat anything he'd ever known back under Harker's lash. Fenner watched the rations get weighed and split fair, with no one's thumb quietly pressing the scale. Watched strangers trade honestly with each other without either side flinching, waiting for the cheat that never came. Within a week, he'd started volunteering for watch shifts nobody made him take. And within days after that, he was, against every expectation he'd walked in with, genuinely happy there. Desmond's agents stopped reporting back one after another. First the scouts, then Fenner, then silence entirely, until he finally pieced together the truth. Yildrest wasn't a camp anymore. It was a full city, and it had grown into one while he wasn't watching closely enough. Rather than admit to his own father that he'd simply lost the race, he invented a story instead, telling House Corvain that Yildrest was harboring a rebellion against them. It was enough to muster the full Enforcer militia and march it out to crush the place under a lie. Holloway's own clerk overheard the muster and rode through the night to warn them. Emery took the news genuinely puzzled by Desmond's fixation on him, while some among Yildrest quietly eyed the numbers coming and worried. The goods refined tally rolled past 340,000 and kept climbing by the hour, ingots and bolts and sealed casks racking up faster than anyone could tally them by hand anymore. It crossed a communal threshold nobody at Yildrest had ever hit before, and the whole square seemed to hum with it. Nib came bobbing out over the stones, chiming brightly that the whole populace's pooled effort had unlocked something entirely new. The communal draw, a way to let every single hand's labor feed one massive working all at once instead of trickling in alone. 2 nights out, the militia made camp, and Emery slipped past the pickets alone to talk it through face to face, unarmed, walking straight up to Desmond's own tent. He said plainly he wanted no rule, no claim on House Corvain, nothing at all but peace. Desmond wouldn't hear a word of it and ordered him seized on the spot. Emery simply stepped backward and vanished, down through a hidden waybill tunnel he'd quietly dug there weeks earlier for exactly this possibility. By dawn, the story of his disappearing act had spread through the whole camp, and soldiers marched reluctant after that, muttering to each other about an enemy who could apparently be anywhere and nowhere at once. Desmond snapped at the nearest of them to shut up and pushed the column onward regardless. 2 more days brought them to the border, and the whole column stopped cold at what waited there. Overnight, Emery poured the communal draw straight into bedrock right at its fullest scale yet, every willing hand in yield rest lending its small share of strength to his. Stripped ground and loose rubble rose and folded themselves into the hollow bulwark, trench after trench, wall after wall, an entire maze of choke points and dead-end yards raised out of raw earth in a single night. Greta and Petra stood at the rim of it, stunned into silence at how fast it had gone up. Even Roswell, who thought he'd seen the limits of what Emery could do, admitted flat out he hadn't known his friend could reach this far. Desmond's militia reached the border and found the terrain unrecognizable. He led the column himself, blade drawn, and even he couldn't explain fortifications that hadn't existed the day before. Undeterred, he ordered the whole force to charge the maze, and thousands of soldiers surged in at once. 8,700 soldiers pushed into the rubble maze at a dead run. Trench walls funneled the whole first wave into a single narrow choke before they'd gone 50 paces, and the charging force dropped to 5,000 before it had even found its footing properly. Wisp and Tobias rained arrows down in steady volleys from the bulwark's ridgeline, while collapsing rubble ramps swallowed an entire second column mid-advance, and the numbers kept falling, down near 2,400 still standing and shrinking by the minute. Greta's watch closed every gap behind them, herding stragglers into dead-end yards with nowhere left to run, and Roswell's ward line mopped up whatever pockets broke through anyway before they could regroup. By the time officers were screaming orders, fewer and fewer men obeyed them, and barely 600 fighters were still on their feet. A final rubble gate ground shut across the last open lane with a sound like a mountain closing, and the scattered remnant kept shrinking toward nothing. Watching from the rear, Desmond finally understood the maze alone was winning this battle, without a single defender lifting a weapon, so he pushed forward himself, dragging stragglers back into formation by the collar. But the remnant kept crumbling anyway, as it neared the maze's final approach. The Rust Serpent, Yieldrest's own resident hauler drawn out for once from its scrap heap, crashed down onto what was left of the column and scattered it with a single sweep of its massive bulk, scarcely even trying. Desmond finally grasped, with real dawning horror, exactly how badly he'd underestimated this place from the very start, down to barely a dozen men left standing around him now. He gave up on fighting the creature entirely and threw everything he had left into one desperate last bid to reach Emery himself instead. A rubble-forged ward construct intercepted him before he'd closed half the distance, disarming him and pinning him to the ground without Emery ever lifting a hand or standing anywhere nearby. His last men's will to fight broke completely watching their commander go down like that, beaten by a thing made of dirt. Desmond's desperate charge ended face down in churned mud. All that ambition and momentum stopped cold in an instant. Roswell hauled him up by the collar, wounded but very much alive, as the last fighters still around him dropped their weapons where they stood without needing to be told twice. Emery ordered no further pursuit of the broken column, and field medics fanned out across the whole maze to the fallen. Casualties turned out far lighter than the sheer scale of the assault had suggested, and the hollow bulwark itself stood barely scarred, its walls holding after a night's worth of hard use. Greta ordered the watch to start an exact count of prisoners, while Desmond, bound and stripped of his rank insignia, was walked inside the settlement he'd marched to destroy. The last rubble gate locked the remaining stragglers out cold in the open ground. The fight over the borderline was finally fully done. A reinforcement column arrived late, well after the fighting had already ended, House Corvain's banners snapping overhead, Silas Corvain himself riding at its very head in full armor, grim-faced as ever. He'd come expecting to arrive in time to back Desmond's easy victory and claim some of the credit for it. Instead, he reined in at the churned battlefield and surveyed the wrecked maze in silence, reading in one long look exactly which side had actually won this. He declared, loudly and for the benefit of everyone within earshot, that he had only ever come to to reinforce his own loyal troops, and not one person present on either side quite believed the sudden reframing. Emery had Bryn and every healer he could spare, tend friend and foe alike, no separate lines for the two sides. Yildrest's own people carried water and clean bandages down the ruined lines without once asking whose uniform anyone was wearing. Wounded militiamen, expecting to be left to rot after losing, stared at the even-handed care they were getting instead, visibly rattled by it, and some of them quietly started wondering aloud who the real leader worth following actually was. Over the following days, the care never once tilted in favor of captor over captive. The same meals, the same blankets, the same clean bunks for everyone. Surrendered soldiers who'd marched here expecting chains watched that same fairness reach every single bunk in the row, day after day, with no catch ever surfacing. Whatever stubborn resistance they'd walked in with chipped away faster than even Garner expected. By the end of it, when he simply gave the whole militia the honest choice to stay or go home, roughly 3,600 of them chose to stay for good. A separate flanking unit had stayed cut off behind the bulwark's outer wall for the entire fight, hearing the chaos but seeing none of it. Cobb's far-spoken voice finally reached their officer, Captain Voss, cutting straight into his thoughts with the news. The main force had lost badly, and Desmond himself had already been taken. Voss weighed it for only a moment before ordering his men to lay down their arms, and most of them looked plainly, openly relieved to finally be done fighting a battle they'd never seen and never wanted. The last rubble gate ground open at last to let them through, and inside waited a settlement, clearly ready for exactly this moment. Bunks made up, rations counted out, blankets already stacked in neat piles, as though someone had known this exact number was coming. Fenner and Draven stepped forward to greet them, familiar faces from their own ranks who'd walked this same road weeks before, grinning like old friends instead of former enemies. Voss's men stared around themselves, caught completely off guard by how welcome, how quickly, how entirely they suddenly felt. Petra pulls two blankets snug around Ren and Kato and settles them by the fire, and this is how she always starts the story. With the appraisal hall back at Cindermore, marble underfoot, and every noble family in their finest coats, and a gift so flashy it lit up the whole room. She describes Desmond's negotiation gift dazzling every eye present that day, silver-tongued and instantly celebrated, applause rolling through the hall before the herald had even finished the naming. Then she tells them the part that matters, plainly and without flinching. Silas Corvain stood in front of the entire hall and called Emery's eye for scrap worthless, naming Desmond heir in the very same breath, as if discarding one son cost him nothing at all. She admits she chose the hollow road over staying behind in comfort, and has never once regretted it, not even on the coldest of those early nights. Some old envy in Desmond, she says, never really healed after that. It just waited for years, quietly, festering under all that celebrated charm, until it finally curdled into the order that sent an army against them. She tells the rest of it plainly too. The hollow bulwark rose overnight and shattered the militia's advancing line before it ever found its footing. The rust serpent crashed straight through the routed column and scattered what remained of Desmond's own guard, and Desmond has been disarmed and held here at Yildrest ever since, given nothing crueler than plain, unhurried care. Emery has Desmond moved out of the holding shed and into a bare tent instead, nothing more than a cot and a canvas roof. Ottilie sets down only a cup of water and a crust of bread, no more, and leaves him to it. Desmond eats it in silence, unbandaged and sound enough to feed himself, with no one hovering while he does. Once the crust is gone, Emery tells him flatly that Yildrest never wanted House Corvain's heirship in the first place, and orders him escorted home instead of paraded or held for ransom. Nobody offers Desmond an explanation for exactly how he lost so completely, and he doesn't ask for one. His surviving honor guard linger at the gate, reluctant to actually walk away from warm barracks and full rations, until Roswell and Tam step in and firmly walk the last stragglers past the checkpoint. The column's departure stalls there anyway. Desmond's own supply wagon turns up with its axle split clean through, and a crate of horse feed meant for the column surfaces misrouted 3 sheds over. Rather than make the men wait on Yildrest's own crews to sort it out, Roswell and Tam patch the cracked axle themselves before letting the column roll. As it finally does, Emery resets a leaning fence post mid-stride on his way past, barely breaking pace to do it. Desmond catches the motion from horseback, mutters something under his breath that nobody quite hears, and rides on without looking back. Garner reports that word of Desmond's route has already reached 3 neighboring courts, traveling faster on rumor than any rider could have carried it himself. Before the news has even settled, Duke Marchant rides in personally, wanting to see the new rampart with his own eyes, and walks its full length before before calling the hollow bulwark the strongest defensive work he's seen outside the capital. He asks, almost sheepish for a man of his rank, whether Yildrest will shelter his niece and nephew through the coming season while Varane's threat hangs over his own border. Ren and Kato protest loudly at being left among total strangers, arms crossed and thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. Emery agrees on the spot and waves off every offer of payment that follows, insisting the arrangement costs him nothing. Watching the Duke's carriage roll back out through the gate, Emery tells Petra quietly that great houses now trust Yildrest with their own blood, not just their coin. On his final inspection pass of the new residential block, checking seams and roofing with his own hands, Emery finds a cluster of Desmond's former militiamen hiding behind a false wall panel, too afraid to come out and too hungry to stay hidden much longer. He lets them stay, on one condition. Each of them writes home first, so no family spends another season not knowing. Clerk Osgood, alone, quiet the whole time the others were arguing, asks to remain for good once the rest have settled, and Garner takes him onto his own staff before the day is out. Word reaches Yildrest that Varane's warlord Malric has finally crushed his last rival border chiefs, folding their scattered banners under his own. When King Osric's herald arrives offering him a border warden's title to keep the peace, Malric hears it for exactly what it is, a beggar's title, handed down from a soft throne that never once bled for its own borders, and sends the herald home carrying Osric's own broken seal as answer. He tells his war council flatly that Vantri's crown no longer merits respect from anyone who has actually fought for what they hold. Then he turns his banners south, straight toward Duke Marchant's line. A long stretch of seasons blurs past in one settled, uneventful run, quiet enough that nobody at Yildrest bothers marking the days, and by the far end of it, its rolls have swollen past every walled town for 100 leagues around. Royal Warden Aldrich Sen arrives expecting a rough frontier camp of tents and mud, and instead walks the paved lanes a long while, boots echoing on stone he clearly wasn't prepared to find, before he can bring himself to say anything at all. Emery and Garner receive him inside the counting office, where Sen proposes folding the flood-plagued Millrace district into Yildrest's holdings, and offers to name Emery the crown's own overseer for the wider region, a title with real weight behind it. Almost as an afterthought stirring his cup, he mentions a struggling river town called Cressfield, its granaries standing empty, and its people going hungry. Emery agrees to both requests before Sen's tea has even had time to cool. A relief convoy rolls south for Cressfield inside the week, wagons loaded with more grain and timber than the town has seen in years. Emery has the town's empty granary rows refilled before the first nightfall, refined timber replacing rotted planks whole blocks at a time, and raises a working cistern where the old well had long since failed and gone dry. Residents line up just to watch the new pump draw a clean, steady stream, some of them crying openly over water that doesn't taste of silt. More volunteer hands arrive daily than the crews can even put to use. Within the season, Cressfield's people fold formally into Yildrest's chartered roles. Palmer fits the newly folded Millrace growers with a fresh round of refined field tools, lighter and sharper than anything the district has worked with before, and together he and Emery watch a single season's yield come in almost doubled. Palmer reports, half laughing and wiping dirt from his hands, that his harvest crews can barely keep pace with the ground anymore. Every relief convoy, every folded district fattens the ledger a little more, and the running tally is already climbing hard, crossing one milestone after another by the time it finally crosses 750,000. Nib's ledger stone flares gold as vault points spike to answer it, brighter than anyone at Yildrest has ever seen it burn. Towers and market spires rise over Yildrest in a single spectacular night, stone shifting and locking into place block by block, as thousands of registered hands work in unison to step the depot into its next tier. Staff rolls surge past 120,000 in that same rush, the census keepers barely able to write the countdown fast enough. Emery names the new sense that comes with its steward's reach, and, testing it for the first time with his eyes closed, calls out a stranded cart 3 districts over before anyone else even knows it's stuck, down to the exact street it's blocking. Millrace's exhausted Miller Reeve, a man named Corliss, arrives with mud to his knees, begging for anything at all to hold back the yearly floodwater for even one season. Emery works the churned bank stone by stone through the whole night, folding it into a levee and a proper channel, rather than conjuring one whole. And by morning, Millrace families are standing in their doorways, watching the water stay dry through a full flood cycle for the first time anyone there can remember. Corliss drops to his knees in the mud, calling Emery a personal blessing on his whole district. Mid-thanks, a silt boar bursts out of the flooded reeds and charges straight at the work crews, and a knot of local trappers scatter it off with lit flares and pot-banging noise before Emery can even turn around to see what's happening. Emery declares the district's first full free day since the siege ended and raises a broad stone bathing pool and swim deck off the cistern line to mark it. Yara descends the forest road alone that same afternoon, drawn by rumor of the place's honest measure, and gets curious enough about the stonework to tug at an unfamiliar valve wheel near the intake manifold. It turns out to be the high-pressure fill line, not the drain, and it opens all at once. A wave crashes over the deck, scattering onlookers and dropping Tam face first into the shallows. Bryn wades in, fishes him out by the collar, and pronounces him only stunned. Emery walks Yara through the proper valve sequence afterward, and she stays to watch the pool refill correctly this time. Emery sets up a scrap ring target range along the practice yard, and it turns into an impromptu contest. Greta puts a blade clean through the center ring, throwing from horseback at a full gallop. Oren calls his own throw, using nothing but his geomantic sense for the wind. Kelder's forge-rigged bolt thrower outscores them both by a clean half ring. The range settles in as a fixture of every seasonal festival after that. Garner mentions, almost in passing, that a laborer's daughter has no naming day token yet. Emery refines a small keepsake shaped like a bird mid-flight and delivers it himself, staying long enough to watch her open it. Her family can't stop retelling the moment at market for days afterward, and other households start finding reasons to bring their own children past his bench too. Emery starts keeping a small tray of finished trinkets on hand for exactly this. Garner notes later that newcomers are increasingly citing the token story as their reason for coming at all. A veteran engineer named Thorne asks for a secluded yard to test his prototypes without an audience, and Emery quietly clears him a walled lot behind the Bazaar Hall's back corridor. While marking out the plot, Emery tests a new ground shift trick on an empty tool shed nearby, easing the whole structure onto fresh footing without a single board coming loose. He posts one plain rule at the workshop door: registered engineers only. Corin talks his way toward the gate, claiming to be Thorne's new apprentice, but the doorward checks the roster and finds no apprentice by that name anywhere on it. Turned away, Corin slinks off, already muttering about a better story for next time. Finch walks Emery through the new intensive husbandry barn, where the pack beasts inside already dwarf anything ever seen on the Hollow Road, and a newly hatched fowl brood needs reinforced roosting frames just to hold them all. Emery runs a hand along one beast's dense, glossy flank, and a gangly young calf beast beelines straight for his scent across the pen, wedging its head under his arm hard enough to nearly knock him flat. Finch hauls it back twice by the halter rope before it finally settles, though it keeps craning its neck back at Emery the whole way out. Mercenary Captain Marlowe Kest rides in late, having long since written Yield Rest off, and tallies the crews and stock spread across the district in silence before he says a word. Emery formalizes the freehand registry that same day, paying licensed crews for contracted danger work, and names Quillen's salvage crew the first fully licensed company. Kest registers his own aging crew on the spot, admitting they lack anyone who knows the ground past the marked road. Rue's people, RiverClan trappers, who'd settled at Yield Rest after drought drove them off the silt marches, point him toward a local trapper named Birch, who names his own terms plainly, and Kest agrees to every one of them. With Kest's crew freshly signed to the freehand registry and already scouting the road with Birch, Yield Rest's older business went right on turning underground. Nib's vault points crossed their newest mark and cracked 2 fresh buried exchange bands open at once, back to back. Quillen led his garrison crew down past the newly unsealed threshold first into the Ashfall Band, where drifting ember haze parted over packed drifts of slag still warm from whatever fire had made them. A slag-hide brute lumbered up out of the dust to meet them, tusks glowing dull orange with banked heat. Doss cracked its hide with 3 iron-toed strikes, unhurried, and that was the end of that. Deeper along the same new stretch, the drowned cistern band's flooded galleries swallowed the crew's torchlight whole the moment they stepped past its threshold, the water black and close overhead. A tallow eel uncoiled from a support pillar, hissing wet and vicious as it lunged, before Ember's forge gift boiled the water around it until the creature surfaced, cooked half through and thoroughly beaten. The Rhyme Hollow Band bit clean through ordinary gear within minutes of entry, so Lance fastened refined hearthstone lockets on the whole crew before they went any farther, steady warmth radiating out against the chill, when a frost-fanged strider came charging out of a side passage. Percy's cleansing light caught it full in the face, blinding and dropping it in the same breath, its momentum carrying it skidding to a stop at his feet. Crews crated the raw haul from all three bands, Rhymeglass and Cinderslag stacked together, and hauled it up for the surface climb. The shipment folded straight onto Yieldrest's ever-climbing goods-refined tally, and a loaded waybill wagon rolled the whole load out with the crew walking behind it, unharmed and already trading bets on what the next descent would turn up. Emery and Nib bent together over a spread of parchment, sketching the layout for the band after next. Nib insisted it needed a proper surprise for visitors this time, something people would still be talking about on the walk home. They settled on favoring foot traffic over raw yield for this one. Emery reminded her, not for the first time, that popularity still had to turn a profit same as anything else in the ledgers. Nib only grinned, her small hands already sketching a wide, gap-toothed face in the margin beside the day's tally. A wandering duelist named Corbin walked the hollow road into town with his sword already loosened in its sheath, and stopped dead at the sight of the market towers rising ahead, taller than anything he'd braced himself for. He demanded, loud enough to turn heads, to test himself against Yieldrest's finest blade. Garner, laughing outright, pointed him instead toward an off-duty crate stacker leaning board against the yard fence. Corbin squared up against the unassuming worker, certain of an easy win before he'd even drawn. The man shrugged off three of his best strikes without so much as stepping back, hands still loose at his sides. Mortified, Corbin learned only afterward that the man had never once held a weapon in his life. Touring the green, Emery stopped mid-step. Half the crowd around him was hauling double loads without a flicker of visible strain. He asked one hauler outright how long she'd trained to manage that, and she insisted, a beat too quickly, that she'd always been this strong. Three more locals waved off the same question in turn before he gave up chasing evasive answers and cornered Garner instead. Garner admitted, a little sheepish, that the bathing pool's refined mineral wash tempered muscle over time, a little more with every soak. An ordinary comfort, Emery realized, had quietly turned itself into a strength engine right under everyone's noses. Emery announced he'd start soaking and training like everyone else, effective immediately. Petra rallied a wall of newly strong residents to physically bar the gate before he got 2 steps closer, reminding him flatly that his collapse last season had been warning enough for one lifetime. Outmaneuvered, he redirected all that thwarted energy into founding a children's school instead. Petra volunteered to teach first, already plotting fresh reasons to stay close by all day. A road-worn column calling itself the Ashfield Company arrived at dusk, led by a man named Dax. He admitted plainly, no dressing it up, that they had made their living stripping battlefield dead elsewhere and waited for the door to close on them. Emery caught his own flinch before it showed and offered legitimate work instead. The company started processing salvaged war metal that same week, housed in a freshly finished wing of Reclaimed Row. One of the new arrivals leaned in close, complimenting Emery's steady hands with a warmth that had nothing to do with metalwork. She caught Greta's flat stare from clear across the wing and suddenly remembered an urgent errand somewhere else entirely. Bryn moved her practice into the healing wing the very day it finished, and her once modest gift surged the instant she crossed the threshold. She pulled a badly wounded guard back from the brink of dying and stood there afterward, stunned by her own hands. When she asked why Yieldrest treated a remedy like that as nothing special, Harlan explained that the wing sat over ground that simply ran stronger than most. The tapped spring beneath the floor was soon given a name of its own, the Clearwell. Bryn's crafters distilled the Clearwell's water into a restorative draft almost by accident, and a willing volunteer's broken arm knit shut within minutes of drinking it. Emery ordered the formula kept strictly inside the healing wing's own walls, nowhere else. The same crafters went on to unveil a second draft that briefly doubled a drinker's strength, and then a third that sharpened memory and wit for one startlingly clear hour. Tam, a man never once called clever growing up, started outproducing crafters twice his age without breaking a sweat over it. His bench turned out 3 fresh formula breakthroughs in a single week, the latest a tonic that flooded a drinker with sudden, glowing vitality. Word came quietly that Rue's River Clan had watched their long fertility drought finally end, and then Tam's own household turned out to be expecting, to his open-mouthed shock. His wife Wynne swore up and down that she had never touched a drop of the tonic herself. Emery pulled Tam Tam aside and told him, gently but firmly, to ease off for a while. Yara's weavers, who had once scraped by on scraps, now held a full wing of the bazaar to themselves, their looms turning out cloth that held its color through hard use season after season. Consul Brigand toured the wing on a diplomatic stopover, held a bolt up to the light, and found no flaw in it anywhere he looked. His own court's finest weavers, he admitted, would call this work outright impossible. A young weaver named Ayla started tinkering past her usual loom work, and the results came fast and kept coming. First, a self-tensioning loom that halved the weaving time outright. Then, days later, a rain-shedding weave for outdoor stalls, followed by a thread that changed color under different lamplight, and a woven filter cloth that strained grit clean out of well water. Her fifth invention stopped a blade cold, and Emery had that one locked away from any outside eye before the ink on its notes was even dry. Undeterred, Ayla delivered a rope woven strong enough to anchor a wagon, then a lightweight tent cloth that shed hollow road dust on its own, then dye formulas matching every depot tier's official colors exactly. By week's end, her workshop floor was buried under 6 new prototypes, all in various states of finished. Half laughing and thoroughly overwhelmed, Emery asked her to slow down for everyone's sake, his own included. Ayla agreed at once, then immediately started sketching a 7th idea anyway. Finch reported that the husbandry barn's breeding stock simply couldn't keep pace with demand anymore, no matter how the numbers were juggled, and Emery authorized a hunting run into the Hollow Reach to restock game properly. Greta assembled an elite squad for it, with Tobias and Wisp riding along as scouts, and the wagonway carried them out to the Reach's edge before midday. Wisp's windcraft flagged a den of greystone lurkers ahead by scent alone, a brood numbering well past 20, fanged and hissing back in the rock. Tobias dropped the lead lurkers with 3 fast arrows before the rest could scatter, and Greta and Pell's line finished the remainder with refined pole spears, no losses on either side. The squad tallied 26 carcasses in the end, and a clean trail besides, and loaded wagons rolled the processed meat back up the wagonway line by nightfall. Emery watched the squad log the hunt like any other routine delivery, and remarked to Petra that it barely even registered for them anymore, this kind of thing. Nearby, Percy fussed over a scrape on Ember's arm, far longer than the scrape itself warranted, while Dawson Lance traded a knowing look and said nothing at all, grinning the whole time behind their hands. Garner declared a feast in the bazaar hall to mark the hall, and newly staffed kitchens, run by recent arrivals still learning the ropes, turned out a spread worth the fuss. Traders from well outside the chartered rolls showed up for the meal alone, no other business in mind that night. Ember finally let Percy walk her to a table, and behind the serving line, the tally board ticked upward yet again for anyone counting. Word reached Yieldrest that Adair's Hold's call to arms had been met with silence, its people having quietly relocated here months before. Worn out from a war none of them had chosen. Lord Perrin Adair himself arrived at the gate not long after, alone and travel-worn, admitting outright that Grellandask's forces had all but swallowed his old lands whole. Privately, he planned to lie low and quietly plot his land's reclamation from here. He toured the bazaar hall, meaning only to scout useful resources for that plan, but the sheer scale of the market towers stopped his plotting mid-thought. A hot meal and a real bed eroded his resolve a little more each day, and within a week, his grand reclamation plan had shrunk down to a half-forgotten errand. Adair started murmuring false claims about Yieldrest's leadership to any newcomer willing to listen. Wick, watching for exactly that kind of trouble, caught the rumor on its second telling, before it could spread past a handful of ears. Adair was quietly walked to Otili's reform house that same evening. Weeks passed with no word of him beyond her door. When he finally resurfaced, the old self-interest was plainly gone from his face. He apologized first to the very newcomers he'd tried to turn against Yieldrest, then asked only for honest work in reclaimed row. No title attached to it this time. Humbled now, Adair asked Emery for help taking his home back, this time without a shred of his old scheming. Emery agreed, on one condition: the people there had to choose to stay after, freely, or none of it counted. Bedrock Wright carved a straight tunnel toward Dask's stronghold overnight, collapsing a week's hard march down to a single night's walk. Rasp's wayfinding instinct pinned Dask's exact chamber somewhere deep inside the stronghold's walls, and an elite strike force gathered at the tunnel mouth, ready to move the moment dawn broke. Grellan Dask spent the evening in his hall, ignoring every report set in front of him without so much as a glance. His second-in-command, Ordell Vance, warned him the perimeter watch was thinning fast and needed reinforcing, and he waved her off, calling instead for another round of wine. Rather than trust the watch to anyone else after that, Ordell took it herself, walking the perimeter in person. Down in the cellar, she found a staircase that had no business existing at all. Greta's strike squad slipped up the same hidden staircase Vance had stumbled onto only nights before, Rasp threading them past a stronghold guard rotation, snoring through its watch with wine cups still in hand. From the tunnel mouth, Emery reached across the link and raised rubble-forged ward constructs straight out of the courtyard stone. Gray, rough-hewn shapes closing like fists around startled men. The animated arms lifted 6 guards clean off their feet and pinned them dangling without one blow landing. Vance, the only sentry alert enough to grasp what she was looking at, ordered the rest to stand down rather than die, proving Dask's walls wrong. In his hall, Grelin Dask was busy berating a servant over a cold supper platter and bragging that his walls could never be breached when a guard burst in stammering that the lower halls were already lost. Dask laughed it off as some drunk's exaggeration, waving his wine cup at the door, until Greta stepped through it herself, armor still dust-streaked from the tunnel, and his boasting collapsed mid-sentence into groveling apology, his own chair and his wine, and anything else she wanted offered up on the spot. Lord Perrin Adair stepped forward next, admitting he'd never truly wanted this feud in the first place, and the two men shook on ending it outright with no more blood spent. Together they asked Emery to fold both holdings into Yieldrest, and he agreed at once, already sketching a waybill spur out to the stronghold before they'd finished asking. The new households pushed Yieldrest's staff tally past 160,000 hands, and the council raised the ledger court, a new hall of polished benches, to seat a representative from every folded territory. The same surge unlocked Twinfold, and on the assay circle, Emery refined a raw clay effigy into a fully autonomous double, its first unsteady steps drawing a small, stunned crowd. It walked and thought entirely apart from him. Emery sent the duplicate to sit through a week of tedious ledger audits, then started routing deliveries and inspections and council waits through it instead of himself. Mid-transfer one evening, his awareness snapped into it mid-bath, only to find Petra and Greta already there, bickering over the closest bench. The duplicate froze dripping and mortified, unable to explain itself, before Emery yanked his awareness back and fled the changing room entirely, ears burning. Still red-eared, Emery commissioned a full surgery hall to be raised beside the healing wing, if only to give everyone somewhere else to be. Word spread that an aging groundskeeper's ruined knees had healed clean after a single Clearwell draft, and he proved it by outrunning the stable hands across the yard, grinning the whole way with dirt still on his boots. A line formed at Bryn's counter before dawn the next morning, every elder in Yieldrest in it, and canes thumping impatiently on the boards. And after the third fistfight over position in the queue, Bryn capped the ration to 1 draft per household. Garner insisted Emery's old quarters no longer suited a man now ruling 6 folded territories, and Emery authorized the refit mostly to quiet him rather than from any vanity of his own. Crews refined the load-bearing pillars up through 3 new stories overnight, and a glass-paned rooftop suite rose last, ringed by an open walkway and stocked with a private bathing spring, a reading gallery, and shelves already half full of borrowed books. Word came back that Cindermore's own halls sat half-emptied by comparison, its old finery gone shabby beside Yieldrest's, and standing on his new balcony that evening, Emery felt oddly uneasy that his home now outshone his father's. At Vantry's capital, Silas pressed formal grievance after grievance against King Osric's council, and one by one, Osric's remaining loyal ministers began vanishing from their posts without explanation. Bought courtiers floated marrying Princess Isolde into House Corvain to settle the matter cleanly, but Osric refused outright, watching what little real authority he had left thin by the week. Rather than yield her, Osric sent Isolde south that same night under Danai's guard, with one order: find allies beyond the court's reach and keep her cover intact the whole way. Isolde and Danai traded their fine cloaks for plain trader's wool, scuffing their boots to look the part, and joined a merchant convoy bound down the hollow road's eastern spur. Weeks on, they crested a rise and found a settlement gleaming under lantern light, paved streets busy well past dark, with no beggars working its gates and no cheat scales at its stalls. A cloth merchant among the traders slipped Danai a small emblem pressed flat into a bolt of dyed wool: Delphine, Osric's longtime informant, hiding in plain sight. Delphine led them past the fairground gates straight toward Emery's own quarters, where he received them, still half expecting another noble come to complain about the new pool's noise. Isolde dropped the trader's accent and stated her name and rank plainly, watching him for the disbelief that never came. Emery startled as Danai produced a genuinely royal signet to back it, all doubt gone at once. Isolde laid out Silas Corvain's court maneuvering in full and asked for Yieldrest's help, and Emery, his jaw tight at the mere sound of his father's name, agreed before she'd even finished asking. Back at court, Silas pressed Osric daily to name a wedding date, until Osric, weary of the charade, finally told him plainly that Isolde was sheltered by the very son Silas had disowned. Silas dismissed it as nonsense until his own scouts rode back pale and confirmed Yildrest's scale with their own eyes. And their report revealed something worse buried in it, that Desmond had long known and hidden the truth of it from him. Silas rounded on his surviving son in front of the full court, voice cracking off the stone, and Desmond admitted he'd hidden it rather than watch more soldiers wasted on a fight they couldn't win. Incandescent, Silas drafted a writ demanding Emery surrender the princess, sealed it with shaking hands, and sent it off by his fastest rider before his temper could cool. Unknown to Silas, one of Renata Ashgrove's agents had spent weeks quietly steering him toward exactly this war. Emery's reply, when it came, was one line. The princess stayed, and so did everything else. And Silas read it once before calling every banner in Cindermore to march. Word of the muster spread for days as House Corvain's banners gathered, and amid the wait, Silas sent a second rider, this time a summons, not a demand. Garner and Petra both argued hard against Emery going anywhere near his father, but he kept thinking back to the appraisal circle and the road out with only Petra beside him, and decided to go anyway. Refusing, he told them, would look too much like fear. At Cindermore's gate, Emery sent the duplicate in, riding behind its eyes from a safe distance, and Silas received him in the very hall where the appraisal circle once stood, its old chalk lines long since scrubbed away. He demanded the princess back, and Emery's refining turned toward his war wagons, and Emery asked plainly what kind of ruler his father even meant to be. Silas boasted of conquest, of conscription, of the strong taking from the weak as they always had and always would, and Emery told him a ruler existed to improve the lives under him, and refused him flatly. Silas's rage broke in an instant, his blade opening the duplicate's chest before anyone could move, and it crumpled to raw refined clay right there on the hall floor, dust settling over the same stone where Emery had once been called worthless. Outside the walls, Emery only staggered from the mental snap, unharmed in body if not pride, and by the time Silas's riders reached Yildrest, he was already waiting to greet them at the gate. What had been an undeclared feud became, that same morning, an openly declared war. Silas called in every banner House Corvain could field, the largest muster the house had ever raised, banners snapping the whole column's length, and marched south with the bulk of his commanders at his side, trusting them and no one else. Garrick, his chief enforcer, stayed behind with a reduced Cindermore garrison, while Desmond rode with the column, kept always within his father's sight and never once out of arm's reach. The moment Silas's column cleared the horizon, Emery halted Yildrest entirely, and he and a ring of refiners drove ground shift through every foundation at once, the ground itself humming under their hands. Overnight, walls and halls and the whole ledger court lifted free as a single mass and crossed the dark miles like a slow tide. By dawn, Yildrest stood whole on open ground beside Cindermore's own wall, wash lines and market stalls intact, as if it had always been there. Garrick's garrison woke to a market district standing where an empty field had been the night before, watch horns sounding in panic up and down the ramparts. And Garrick sealed the gates without any idea whether it was a siege or a trade delegation. In the confusion, Roswell's warded team scaled Cindermore's lightly manned eastern wall, while Quillen's crew found the same servant's stair Halloway had used for years of smuggled reports. Together, they reached the guest wing where King Osric had been politely held, and he asked, more relieved than afraid, whether that was really a market square out there. Stepping onto the balcony, he found Yildrest filling the entire skyline. Silas's column reached Yildrest's old ground at forced march pace, banners still flying, and found nothing but flattened grass, cold fire rings, and cart ruts leading nowhere at all. Scouts reported no trail to follow. The whole settlement simply wasn't there anymore, and Silas's fury broke over the nearest tent pole, splitting it clean through. A lathered rider reached the column within the hour, breathless with news that Cindermore itself was surrounded, its gates held, and Garrick taken without a fight. Silas went still, understanding all at once that the empty field had never been the real target, and wheeled the column around to drive it back north at speed. 3 nights into the march back, Greta's squad hit the baggage train and vanished before anyone could respond, while Tobias and Wisp picked off relief riders one by one from the tree line and melted back into the dark before a torch could find them. Grain sacks turned up slit and spoiled at every dawn count, rations shrinking by the day, and by the 5th night, whole companies were slipping away into the dark, rather than stand another watch. Silas refused every officer's plea to make camp and rest. The column crested the ridge to find Yildrest's walls grown thicker still, new ramparts bristling with repeater rigs. Kelder's forge hall had finished only days before, oiled and gleaming in the light. Kelder walked the wall herself, loosing volley after volley that punched clean through raised shields, and soldiers swearing it had to be sorcery broke ranks and fled in a fresh wave. Silas ordered the remnant forward anyway, straight into the gap between the walls, and barricade reflex snapped crated stock into a maze of blind corridors around them, walls of stacked goods rising in heartbeats, while Bedrock Right dropped the ground itself into shallow trenches under whole companies at once. Formations split into blind pockets, shouting for officers they couldn't see over crates they couldn't climb, and company after company surrendered to the nearest line rather than keep fighting blind. By the hour, the army dwindled down to a hardcore around Silas himself. With their horses lost to the trenches, Silas's remaining specialists fought on foot now, boots sliding in churned mud, while Yildrest's farmhands and refiners held the line anyway, their refined tools doing work no farmer's tools should. Roswell's bastion ward turned aside blow after blow along the weakest stretch, shield arm never wavering, and Silas himself waded through the press, throwing armored men aside like sacks of grain. Silas spotted Emery past the line and cut straight for him, blade still wet, only for Desmond to step into his path, sword raised against his own father for the first time in his life. Silas snarled at him to stand aside, and Desmond told him flatly, voice steady despite everything, that he'd hated him since boyhood, then turned to Emery and said their father had never valued a single thing in either of them beyond their use to him. Desmond's guard finally broke under the relentless weight of Silas's overhand strikes, driven step by step toward the shattered barricade line until there was nowhere left to give ground. He screamed his brother's name across the battlefield din, and Emery shouldered through the press to reach his arm. Emery read the damage the way he read raw ore laid bare on the assay floor. Cracked ribs, torn tendons, the flaws of a body pushed past what it could pay. He worked the break shut with kinsman's temper, a kinsman's own temper, answering flawed metal, and torn muscle drew true and whole again under his hands. Exhausted battle fatigue burned off Desmond like skimmed slag off a poured ingot. The tremor in his sword arm stopped completely. Color came back into his face, and he planted his feet, steady for the first time in an hour. He charged Silas in a two-handed arc that rocked the older man back on his heel, sparks scattering bright enough to light the nearest face's gold. Corvain militiamen froze mid-stride, weapons forgotten in their hands. Even Silas's own honor guard stared in open disbelief at what they were seeing. Then a cloaked figure broke from Silas's own ranks and drove a blade for Desmond's unguarded back, but the point only skidded off cloth instead of finding flesh. Desmond checked his side, more startled than hurt, and found a gray weave showing through his torn coat where the blade should have opened him. Roswell slammed the attacker off balance shield first. Pell pinned the sword arm flat to the ground, and Greta wrenched back the hood. The face underneath belonged to no one any of them recognized. For a breath, the battle noise fell away around Silas entirely. He was a boy again, watching weight-cheating merchants strip his family's stores bare, while his own father begged, broken, at a rival's gate for a debt that was never truly owed. He had vowed then, small and furious, that weakness would never cost him anything again. Every warehouse he had built since, every title he had claimed, answered that one boyhood vow. The memory snapped shut like a closing ledger, and he found himself swaying on his feet before the son he had spent a lifetime sidelining. He swung his last strike with everything his body had left in it. His blade sheared clean off at the crossguard. Desmond's counter dropped him flat onto the broken paving, and Silas lay staring up at the sky and at the sun he had cast aside, the head of House Corvain, beaten in the open by someone he could never simply disown. Cindermore's household looked to Emery as its new master by rights of conquest, but he declined any seat inside House Corvain's own walls without hesitation. Halloway offered to stay on as interim steward until the house found its footing again, and Emery took him up on it, leaving him and Hendrik behind, with a waybill line running straight back to Yildrest for anything they needed. Desmond, for his part, chose to stay and help rebuild the household his father had spent a lifetime running into the ground. By full muster, Silas was already gone from the field, a handful of his oldest, most loyal guard missing alongside him. No note, no message, only trampled and empty ground where he had stood. Halloway reported it as plainly as he reported anything. There was nothing left here that was still Silas's to take. No one at Cindermore lifted a hand to chase their former head into the dark. The goods refined tally cleared 2 million overnight on the strength of Cindermore's folded stock alone. The newly absorbed rolls pushed staff past 200,000 hands on the books. The surge tripped loose something new in Emery, a sense he had never felt reaching for before, and he stepped clean through folded ground for the first time in his life. Waystride, he called it. The road behind him refined shorter than the road he had actually walked. Ledger Sense flagged a small, persistent, hidden signal buried deep in the incoming reports, and it traced back to Inez, a quiet clerk who had been sending coded notes toward the Tariff Concord for weeks. Emery heard her out rather than turning her over to Atali outright, and decided to keep her on staff anyway. Testing Waystride again afterward, alone in the yard, he found the fold now carried a passenger along with him. He pulled Tam through the fold to prove it worked, and the two of them landed together, without warning, straight in the doorway of Tam's own kitchen. Stunning wind mid-stir at the hearth, spoon frozen halfway to the pot. Staff and Tally gains together greenlit the long-planned wagonway line at last. Rails and a squat iron cargo car rose along the yard within days, Emery working the first rail length true in one long unbroken pull of refined metal. Petra climbed aboard to inspect the finished car, running a hand along its riveted seams, and it lurched into motion under her before the brake was ever set. Emery sprinted alongside the length of the yard, wrestling the brake lever back under control before the car could outrun them both. Emery offered the wagonway to King Osric's court outright, no toll and no condition attached. Osric, Isolde, Duke Marchant, and Consul Bregan boarded together for a demonstration ride down the finished stretch, and the car's speed left all four of them breathless, gripping the rail with both hands. Osric and Isolde toured Yieldrest together as father and daughter for the first time in longer than either would say aloud, and Osric formally chartered the wagonway under joint crown administration before the day was out. Emery, already thinking past it, proposed tunneling a second line entirely underground, planning to run the whole dig through several twinfold doubles, working at once to save years of labor. A towering stranger strode up to the main gate, head and shoulders over anyone standing near it. The gate guard demanded she state her business first, spear leveled, so she answered by lifting the spear clean out of his hands and over his own head, then setting it back down gently, apologizing for the demonstration as though she'd only meant to be helpful. A second guard lunged for the alarm bell in a rising panic. She caught the rope before it could ring a single note. Garner arrived at a dead run to smooth things over, and the stranger introduced herself simply as Brigid, no title attached. Garner sent word up the line to Emery directly, rather than handle it alone, and Emery came down himself and waved her straight in through the gate. Brigid proposed a tailoring stall of her own design on the spot, sketching its layout in the dust with one finger, and Emery granted her a corner of the hall to try it. Petra bristled visibly at how much attention the newcomer drew from every passing eye. He quieted it without much trouble, with a promised evening set aside just for her. Brigid's stall drew a steady, curious crowd within days of opening. Greta dropped by to look the newcomer over herself, unannounced, and found Petra already there ahead of her, doing exactly the same thing. The two traded a long, measuring look across the bolts of cloth, neither one saying a word about why she'd actually come. And that evening, both of them lingered near Emery's quarters far longer than usual, each noticing the other noticing. For the first time since either of them had known him, their rivalry felt aimed squarely at each other instead of at him. Weeks on, Brigid's corner stall had outgrown its space twice over. Her custom fittings drew buyers from well beyond Yieldrest's own borders, and a whole side wing of the hall was handed over to her outright to keep up with demand. She trained a dozen apprentices just to keep pace with the orders piling in. Traders soon started asking for Yieldrest goods by her name alone rather than the settlements, and even Halloway's old trade ledgers, forwarded on from Cindermore, began listing her separately from everything else. Garner emerged from Brigid's stall one afternoon in a sharp new coat, tailored close and clearly expensive, and his own visiting sister nearly walked straight past him on the concourse without recognizing him at all. Rumor of the tailor reached a passing river trade caravan, making for another market entirely. Its captain scoffed outright that no roadside stall could possibly be worth the detour, then rerouted his whole caravan through the bazaar hall anyway, just to see for himself. Rasp found a sunken stair sunk into the new Cindermore ground, one that dropped past every mapped buried exchange band charted so far, deeper and colder than anything on record. Desmond cornered Emery the moment word reached him, demanding to see it himself, and Petra and Greta both volunteered to escort him at once, squaring off openly over which of them had the stronger claim to go. Emery settled it the only way that wouldn't start a second fight, naming them joint escort together. Quillen took the crew down, himself, Roswell, Percy, Doss, Ember, Lance, and Rasp, while Emery quietly worked a fresh twinfold double to walk in his own place, unwilling to risk the real thing so deep and so blind. The stair dropped the party into air gone thin and bitterly cold, Ember's forge-lit palm throwing the only light down the whole length of the shaft. The first husk sentinels peeled off the walls at once, joints grinding like a mill left to rust. Doss met the lead one head-on, his hammer folding its plate inward with a single blow. Lance's pry bar hooked a second clean at the knee joint and dropped it. Greta's blade opened a third at the seam, heat finishing what the cut started. A fourth grabbed for Petra before Percy's cleansing light scoured its grip off her arm. Roswell's shield turned a fifth sentinel's swing wide of its mark. The passage ahead narrowed to a slot too tight for their gear to pass, until the double folded the shortest path through solid stone by feel alone, widening it just enough for the whole party to file through single file. Beyond it stood a full suit of plate, whole and entirely unrusted, untouched by the centuries around it. Desmond pushed past Quillen into the niche-lined chamber before anyone could stop him, and rust mites boiled out of every niche at once in a swarming gray tide. The passage ground shut behind the whole party without warning, sealing them in with the swarm. The double drew a squat ward construct up out of the rubble underfoot to wade straight into the mass, crushing a path through by sheer weight, while Quillen scrambled atop a fallen pillar with his crossbow to pick off what slipped past. Construct and crossbow together cleared the last of the swarm fast. The party made camp in a side chamber, the double sealed smooth behind them, working the bare walls warm to close off the draft still leaking in from the passage. A waybill marker relayed word back up to Yieldrest's kitchens within minutes, and a hot meal came down the line alongside a bundle of Hearthstone lockets to keep the cold at bay. Greta and Petra ended up sharing a single blanket by the fire, still bickering under their breath the whole time. For a while, deep under a dead house's ruin, the vault felt almost like a strange cramped kitchen back home. The passage finally opened on a hall floored entirely in polished dark stone, a raised carved resting slab sitting untouched by the dust settled thick around it. Nib flickered into being at the threshold, amber eyes wide with open warning, and Rasp read her frantic gestures faster than anyone else could. This chamber still had a keeper. Desmond stepped past the warning anyway, boots ringing loud on the stone floor, and the slab's lid ground open entirely on its own, no hand touching it. What rose from within wore rank and rust, like a second skin of armor, and it was furious. Desmond lunged at the Guardian before anyone could catch his arm, and dark binding light snapped tight around both his wrists mid-stride. Rusted fire licked out from the Guardian's gauntlet straight toward him. Roswell threw himself bodily between them, his shield catching the blast until its rim glowed white-hot and began to crack under the strain. Percy's cleansing light scoured the dark grip off Desmond's arms an instant later, and he dropped free, scorched but breathing, dragged back out of range by Petra. The Guardian called out in a grinding ancient voice that carried through the whole chamber, and somewhere in the shadows, a husk knight answered, stepping out whole and armored to meet it. Doss and Lance brought the night down together as more of them began, slowly, to stir. 4 floors under Cindermore's old bones, the fight for the Crownward Band's Guardian Chamber ground into a second night. Doss and Lance battered down a second rising husk knight together, trading blow for blow until its plating gave and folded. Percy's cleansing light pinned the corroded warden's grip in place, buying the room a few precious seconds it badly needed. At the entry stair above, well clear of the crumbling drop, Emery worked a fresh lump of raw clay through both hands, folding and tempering it the way he always did, until it stopped being clay and started being a second self built to walk where he wouldn't. The proxy strode down alone the instant Quillen's line opened, and drove a refined chisel spike straight into the exposed crack at the warden's core. The ancient construct's voice fractured into a dying, grinding wail, and every husk knight summons it had raised across the chamber froze mid-stride and crumbled to rust where it stood. The chamber fell silent, but for settling rubble and the drip of condensation off the ceiling. A breath later, the proxy went slack, its borrowed mind link snapping quietly back to Emery at the stair above, leaving him untouched by any of it. Over the relay, Quillen's voice reported the chamber clear and ordered the crew to start cataloging whatever salvage it had left behind. Cataloging the salvage took the better part of the following week. Crates of scrap and rune-etched plating hauled up and racked at the depot one load at a time. It was on a routine sweep of a side passage, well after the chamber itself had gone quiet and dull with familiarity, that Rasp's uncanny instinct pulled the crew toward a second sealed wall nobody had marked on any of the earlier passes. Doss rapped the stone with his knuckles, and this time, faint tapping answered back from the far side. A muffled, irritable voice demanded to know who was disturbing his wall. Word came back down the relay from Emery, rather than an order to breach it. Offer an honest trade first, force nothing. Ember cut a narrow gap, just wide enough for one person to pass through, and out stepped a wiry old man, squinting hard against the light, already dodging every question thrown at him before it finished leaving anyone's mouth. He wouldn't even confirm his own name straight, giving a different mumbled answer each time he was pressed, until the crew simply settled on calling him Fenlo and letting it go. Something about how carefully he dodged everything told Emery there was more to the man than a hermit hiding from dust, and, unsettled, he decided to keep the discovery quiet for now, at least until he understood exactly what they'd dug up. Back above ground, Fenlo was given a spare room inside Emery's own expanded quarters, which he treated less like lodging and more like a stage. Garner asked what trade he'd practiced down there and got 3 different, entirely contradictory answers before giving up on a 4th. Palmer asked how long he'd actually been sealed in. Fenlo changed the subject before Palmer had finished the sentence. Asked, reasonably, for his surname, he suddenly remembered something urgent he needed to check on and left the room without another word. Over the following days, he vanished mid-sentence more than once, always chasing some pressing errand nobody could later name. Tam asked about his craft mark, the kind every trained hand carried somewhere, and Fenlo claimed unconvincingly that he'd simply forgotten where he put it. Staff started quietly betting on whether he'd ever manage to finish a single full sentence in front of them, and the household settled, resigned, into simply working around the gaps he left everywhere he went. Watching the whole performance from the doorway, Petra decided, privately and firmly, that she would be the one to get him talking straight, whatever it took. Across the bazaar hall, Corin still carried his shy, unresolved crush on Isla, though lately, his eyes kept drifting toward Brigid's stall instead of Isla's workbench. Soren warned him flatly that Brigid was impossible to actually read, and Doss, passing by with an armload of crates, added that half the yard had already tried and failed at exactly that. Undeterred, Corin resolved to figure out what actually made Brigid open up. Watching him moon around her stall for the 3rd day running, Petra privately decided he needed something better to occupy his afternoons, and proposed, ostensibly to solve the problem, that Brigid take him on as an unpaid errand hand. Brigid shrugged and agreed on the spot without bothering to ask why, glad enough for the free help regardless of the reasoning behind it. By the very next morning, Corin was hauling bolts of cloth across the hall instead of courting anyone at all. Yieldrest's registered staff tally climbed past 270,000 hands that week, a number that would once have sounded like a fever dream. Garner proposed marking the surge with a proper festival, rather than another quiet counting, and Emery agreed at once, provided whatever fighting it involved stayed strictly survivable. He committed a wide stretch of refined stock toward raising a purpose-built arena in the fairground district, and within days it stood finished. Roswell and Kelder padded the ring's barriers with refined alloy, so no stray blow could ever reach the crowd, and Bryn's healing wing set up a standing trauma post at ringside before a single bout was even scheduled. Garner announced the grand prize himself, grinning. One personal favor, redeemable against Emery and nobody else. News of the favor prize spread through Yieldrest faster than the festival date itself ever could. Entrants registered by the hundreds within the first day alone. Seasoned freehand fighters lining up shoulder to shoulder with ordinary stall hands, clerks, and farmhands who'd never held a bracket seat in their lives. Tobias's bow work drew early murmurs as a favorite, and word spread fast about Garth, an underhold miner who flattened 3 opponents in a row without ever slowing his pace. Pell's steady shield work ground down one qualifier after another with grim, patient inevitability, and Brigid dispatched her own qualifying rounds in a handful of moves apiece, barely working up a sweat. The qualifying field thinned steadily from hundreds down to a final bracket, and by the time the sun went down, 16 names stood posted on the arena's gate frame. Betting pools quietly began forming around the 4 early favorites before the ink on the postings had even dried. By the day of the main event, the stands filled well past even the qualifying rounds crowd, rails packed 3 deep on every side. King Osric's party and Consul Bregan's delegation arrived together, and Lady Helena, part of Bregan's retinue, claimed the seat of honor directly beside Emery without waiting to be asked. She spent the better part of an hour peppering him with questions about his refining gift, openly delighted by every answer. 2 rows back, Petra's smile went visibly tight, watching the 2 of them lean together, laughing at something only half funny. In the round of 16, a wiry courier outpaced a heavier stall hand's every swing, landing 3 clean touches before the man could even adjust his stance. And the judges called the bout on speed alone. A quiet cistern tender got pushed steadily toward the ring's edge, losing ground the whole way, until, cornered, he put his opponent down with one wild, desperate heave that startled the crowd as much as it startled him. He stood there afterward blinking at his own hands, plainly as surprised as anyone that he had that kind of strength in him at all. Pell circled behind his shield and gave no ground whatsoever. His opponent tried simply backpedaling to run out the clock, and the crowd jeered the stalling loudly enough that the judges docked him a point, letting Pell win on patience the moment time finally ran out. Garth's opponent overreached on a lunge and went down hard on his own planted foot, ankle twisting under him before Garth had even closed the distance. Rather than press the advantage on a man who could no longer stand properly, Garth waved for the healers instead of the win, and the crowd cheered the mercy louder than they would have cheered any finish. Off in the stands, Lady Helena watched all of it with open, undisguised delight. A short break let the arena reset before the bracket narrowed to the final 8. Tobias read the wind's drift and adjusted his aim on the fly, his arrow catching his opponent's guard strap dead center, and advanced barely winded. Pell's next opponent tried speed instead of strength against him, but Pell's shield ate every hit until the man simply wore himself out, and Pell advanced on patience yet again, same as always. Bridget met a Windrise-trained wrestler built far past her own usual size, turned his own momentum straight back against him, and dropped him in one clean throw without ever taking a real hit herself. Garth's opponent tried to outendure his raw power, rather than match it blow for blow, but Garth simply outlasted him, landing the heavier strike in every exchange, and advanced bruised but still unbeaten. A 5th bracket slot went to a sharp-eyed weaver cousin of Tobias's, who was matched next round against Pell and lost cleanly to his shield work. A 6th slot, an Ashfield Company recruit, fell to Garth's reach soon after. The bracket narrowed again, down to a final 4, Tobias, Pell, Bridget, and Garth, the last names still standing. In the break before the semifinals, Emery studied both matchups closely, turning them over the way he turned over any problem worth solving, quietly, telling no one else. He walked Tobias through a telegraphed wind-up tell he'd spotted in Bridget's fighting, and walked Pell through Garth's habit of overcommitting his right side on the 3rd exchange of any bout. Neither fighter thought to ask where the intel had come from. The semifinal bell rang, and the stands quieted down. Tobias opened with a shot aimed exactly where Emery had marked, but Bridget shifted off the tell a half second before it landed, her own instinct reading the setup even though Tobias himself never knew it was one, and closed the distance to end the bout in 2 more exchanges. Tobias bowed out more impressed than bitter, shaking his head at how clean the red had been. In the second semifinal, Pell braced exactly where Emery had flagged Garth's overcommitment, but Garth adjusted mid-swing on pure instinct, correcting the habit on the spot without seeming to think about it, and his overcorrected blow still found Pell's guard and buckled it anyway. Pell tapped out, rather than take a second one. Garner remarked afterward, dryly, that both of Emery's tips had gotten read straight through regardless. Emery watched both losses without saying a word about what he'd actually tried, and decided, quietly, that the final needed no help from him at all. His nerves for it only climbed higher as he watched the empty ring reset for the last time. Bridget and Garth took the ring for the tournament final, the stands settling in with betting slips already tilted hard toward Garth's raw power. He opened with the same heavy, overcommitted swing pattern that had carried him through the entire tournament. Bridget gave ground twice, watching the timing of it settle into a rhythm until she clocked the half-beat pause he always took right before committing to the swing. On his 3rd attempt, she stepped inside instead of back, caught his overextended arm, and pivoted his own weight against him in one smooth motion. Garth hit the ring floor hard enough to shake the front rows of the crowd, and though he was back up within a breath, the fight had already flipped entirely. Bridget pushed the same timing red twice more without missing once, and a final clean throw put Garth flat on his back and staying there. The judges called it without a moment's hesitation or debate, and nobody in the stands questioned how cleanly the match had ended. Bridget was named champion on the spot, grinning ear to ear, already eyeing the favor she meant to collect. The Faro Cross Rail delegation came out to watch a demonstration bout, and 2 young recruits obliged them with a friendly spar meant to show off Yieldrest's training. A wild swing sent a crate of trade samples toppling straight toward the guests. Without so much as blinking, Emery snapped a bedrock right anchor into the dirt and caught the whole crate clean out of the air, one-handed, not a bottle inside so much as rattled. The delegates stared at the catch like he had just watched a card trick with no cards, then signed off on expanded wagonway terms on the spot before anyone could talk him out of it. Bridget, who had appointed herself referee months ago and never once relinquished the title, chose that exact moment to announce that her tournament forfeit was finally formally due. The prize, she said with relish, was a full month of Emery disguised as a woman. Garner opened his mouth to object on principle, then remembered the delegate had just signed the best trade deal of the season and left him no leverage at all. Petra burst out laughing before catching herself half-heartedly, badly. Palmer and half the watching staff were already trading coins on how long Emery's composure would would survive. Bridget produced a wig, a paint box of cosmetics, and a fully finished dress, all clearly assembled in secret over weeks of stolen evenings. She christened the disguise right there in front of everyone, Lady Miriam Hale, envoy of nowhere in particular, arriving from nowhere anyone could check. Fenlo tracked the entire fiasco from a safe, comfortable distance. Wheezing with hungover laughter, he did not even try to hide from the neighbors. Greta ran her squad through another brutal defensive circuit, sweat and shouted counts filling the yard, before breaking off to hunt down Emery about more anchor post reinforcements. She found Lady Miriam Hale instead and stopped dead in a genuine, open-mouthed double take. Petra hissed from nearby that the stranger was, in fact, really Emery. Greta barked out disbelieving laughter loud enough to turn heads, then simply asked Miriam for the anchor posts anyway, since a job was still a job. Emery as Miriam set them one by one without ever once breaking the higher, forced pitch he had settled into his voice. Consul Bragan's delegation arrived early for a follow-up visit, and Lady Helena swept ahead of the whole group, mistaking Miriam for a highborn arrival of matching rank. She seized both of Miriam's hands in hers and planted an enthusiastic foreign cheek kiss before anyone nearby could explain the mistake. Startled half out of her wig, Emery as Miriam extracted both hands gently but firmly and took a careful step back. Emery kept the act running, sensing plainly that nobody around him actually wanted it to end yet. Still fully disguised, he met Marlowe Kest at the freehand registry and demonstrated both a bedrock right anchor and a waist-ride jump to settle whatever skepticism remained about the new envoy. Marlowe, no longer doubting a single thing, was openly floored. He reported that his patrol had caught a lone raider at a supply wagon along the road, a young woman, starving, from a settlement gripped by famine somewhere north of the frost line. That night, Emery slipped down to the cell alone, well past when anyone else would notice, and opened a quiet seam in the wall with bedrock right rather than touch the lock. Talia woke wary, eyeing the strange highborn woman standing over her with open suspicion. Miriam offered safe passage home and admitted, plainly and without flourish, that she wanted peace rather than another raid on anyone's wagons. Talia weighed a stranger's offer against another night in a cage and decided the stranger won, agreeing tight-voiced, still braced the whole time for some hidden betrayal. Waystride folded the frozen distance down to a bare few strides, and they came out together on a rise above wind-battered longhouses and empty frost-cracked grain pits. Talia bolted downhill, shouting names into the wind, swallowed almost instantly by a crowd of her own people. The crowd's relief curdled fast into open alarm at the stranger trailing a few steps behind her. Bone hooks and spears ringed Miriam within moments, close enough to feel the cold iron. Talia threw herself bodily between them, shouting that the outsider had freed her from Marlowe's patrol, then hauled Miriam through the tense ring toward a longhouse before anyone could reconsider. Adeline came storming out, furious that Talia had let herself get caught raiding in the first place, but softened visibly the instant she heard this stranger had carried Talia all the way home for nothing in return. Adeline stated flatly, sniffing the air once, that there was not one trace of threat scent on the woman at all. Emery introduced himself only as Miriam Hale, nothing more, no titles, no house. Adeline warned her plainly, without softening it. The Enclave killed uninvited men on sight, no exceptions made for envoys. Adeline admitted, grudgingly, that their foraging grounds had turned unsafe and stripped bare for a season now. Miriam offered to work a fallow hillside her own way, no strings attached, and Adeline granted her the scraped, hard-packed plot just outside the walls. Overnight, the dead soil turned rich, dark, and fully tilled, ready for seed by morning. Talia worked beside her, turning the field's first furrows with her own hands, and together they sowed long rows of hardy grain and root. Days compressed as the bare plot greened into thick young shoots, then stood ready at last, heavy with grain, root, and leafy greens. The whole enclave turned out together to bring in an overflowing harvest. Adeline weighed a double handful of grain in her palm and said nothing at all, which said everything. Emery raised a shared cook hall at the field's edge, without waiting to be asked, and communal hearths let the whole enclave eat from one common pot for the first time in memory. The relief effort was folded straight into Yieldress's standing charter network. By then, even the youngest watchguard on the wall had started calling her by name, unprompted. Emery turned next to the Enclave's fouled runoff ditches, refining a self-flushing waste channel straight into the Palisades corner and raising a second spring-fed washing trough near the longhouses, clean water running where sludge had pooled for years. Testing the new flow valve herself, she got it badly wrong. It kicked back hard and soaked her thoroughly from wig to to boots. Sagging wig, dripping dress, and all, she beat a hasty, thoroughly embarrassed retreat across the yard. Talia caught only the tail end of it and turned quickly away to hide her laughter behind one hand. Emery dried out alone by a private fire, thoroughly humiliated, but no fanfare ever followed any of it. People simply started using the new facilities without comment, and by week's end, both the illness complaints and the old runoff smell were entirely gone. Emery had Miriam's own lodge set apart from the others, citing an envoy's need for privacy, and behind its closed door, he dropped the disguise every single night, just long enough to actually rest his own face. Talia had grown genuinely fond of her odd guest by then, and took to lingering near the lodge in the evenings. One night, she knocked with a flimsy excuse about a torn blanket seam that needed mending. Emery barely got the wig reattached in time before easing the door open a crack. Talia tried to peer past his shoulder into the dim room, curious about his obvious breathlessness, and asked far too casually about the scorched hair and green tallow smell drifting out past him. His pulse spiked hard as her eyes drifted toward the crooked wig. He reset the stray strand as though he were only fixing windblown hair, then claimed a sudden, urgent cook hall errand, and all but fled into the dark. Talia was left standing there, more curious than ever, none the wiser, filing the moment away. Windrise step riders crossed the frost line right at dawn, and the watch waved them through without much fuss, long familiar with Kadan's old courting visits. The envoy repeated the same tired offer he always brought, grain in exchange for a marriage bond, as if the years hadn't changed a thing. Adeline received him in the cook hall and deliberately let him see the stores in full, shelf after shelf. The granaries, she told him plainly, were fuller now than they had been in a full generation. His confidence visibly faltered at the sight of the packed shelves, though he pressed on anyway, insisting old debts and old promises still stood between their peoples. Adeline refused him in full. A paid debt, she said, needed no repeating. Stiff with insult, the envoy remounted without a shred of courtesy and rode out hard, his anger plain across his whole face. Talia muttered under her breath that Kadan would not take the answer well at all. Adeline only agreed, watching the riders go. Kadan received his humiliated envoy's report in cold, deliberate silence. Word of an enclave grown suddenly richer than his own hardened his jealousy into something sharper and uglier. And before the day was out, he sent riders to the Bramble Reach with an open offer to attack together. An enclave woman named Neve slipped out alone to a boundary cairn under cover of dusk and traded quiet whispers of an outsider who conjured granaries and defenses seemingly out of nothing at all. A scout reported Kadan mustering riders along the frost line in numbers. Adeline took the news in stride at first, unworried by his long history of empty threats, until the scout added that Farron's Bramble Reach banners now rode alongside them too. Neve's careless boasting had let the real shape of it slip. Farron meant to seize the outsider outright, not just settle an old grudge. Working through the night, Emery refined the whole palisade into a staggered rubble rampart and lined the open approach with false paths and narrow choke lanes, all of it standing ready well before dawn. At dawn, the combined riders funneled straight into the waiting choke lanes, exactly as planned. Archers and the spear line held the rampart against the bogged-down horses, while Wastride relayed Emery between weak points faster than any runner alive could manage. Kadan's own mount was pinned harmlessly between closing rubble walls, horse and rider both shaken but whole. The Bramble Reach riders lost their stomach for it fast and pulled back first, and the remaining Windrise riders laid down their weapons in general. Ragged surrender soon after. Emery moved through the field, tending wounded on both sides without distinction. Friend and attacker alike, refined bandages and drafts passed hand to hand until the moaning stopped. Adeline set her terms plainly to the defeated riders. No more raids, no more courtship demands, ever again, and no argument about it. Emery pledged the same farmland and cook hall relief to the Bramble Reach that the Enclave itself now enjoyed, an offer that landed harder than any threat could have. Adeline stripped Kadan of his chieftainship right there on the open field, and installed Torvin, his steadier, calmer brother, in his place, who accepted the burden with visible, quiet relief. Over the following weeks, Emery repeated the same fixes across both clans in turn, tilling fields, raising cook halls, patching ditches, until the pattern felt almost routine. Word of one woman single-handedly ending 3 people's hunger spread fast along every trade road between the Frost Line and Farrowcross. Marlowe Kest eventually noticed a full month pass without a single raided wagon anywhere near the Frost Line, which was, in his professional opinion, unheard of. Asking around for details, he got back only scattered fragments about an unnamed highborn woman nobody could quite describe the same way twice. He couldn't place her at all, and filed the whole mystery away, thoroughly impressed despite himself. The month Bridget had demanded finally ran out to the day. Emery peeled off the wig, the cosmetics, and the trade dress for good, letting out a long breath he felt he had been holding for weeks straight. Only afterward did he notice one stubborn habit refusing to leave. The higher pitch had not fully left his voice at all. Emery folded the last of the Miriam wardrobe away himself, locking wig, dress, and powder into a trunk at the foot of his bed, rather than burning any of it, since Bridget would only make him sew a replacement if he did. He kept one spare twin-fold double primed under that same auburn-wigged guise, just in case the disguise ever needed reviving on short notice. Alone at last, he tested his own voice in the empty room, pitching it as low as he could manage, and found it still sat a shade higher than it used to before the month began. He decided against mentioning it to anyone and got on with the day. Weeks then slid past in a blur, while the wagonway quietly kept growing without him watching it happen. Scattered waybill relay posts across every folded territory, from Crestfield to the Millrace District to Adair'shold, merged on their own schedule into one seamless citywide circuit, the Freight Loop, a single continuous route that let a loaded wagon roll depot to depot without ever stopping to hand off its cargo. Cobb's far-spoken warning cut through Emery's ledger tally without any warning at all. Varaine's army had broken the border outright, and Duke Marchant's line was buckling under the full weight of Warlord Malric's advance. Emery and Greta traded one look, grabbed nothing but what they were already carrying, and left within the minute, doubling a waist-ride jump to fold the entire distance down into a single held breath. They arrived to a line barely holding, soldiers stumbling on their feet from days without proper rest. Emery raised a rubble rampart maze clean across Varaine's main approach, its walls rising in seconds, where open field had stood a moment before, and Greta drove a countercharge straight through the lanes it left clear, scattering the front ranks before they could reform. Miles off, Yildrest's own agents were already quietly buying out Varaine's mercenary contracts one company at a time, while waybill-linked markets flooded the region with cheaper goods and undercut Malric's war funding at the root. Paid companies deserted the instant their coins stopped arriving, packing up mid-March without a word to their officers. Cut off and outmaneuvered, Malric's officers signaled a full withdrawal within the hour, and Marchant's exhausted defenders stood at the ramparts, staring at a retreat none of them had dared hope for that morning. Emery and Greta reported the invasion broken directly to Marchant, who sat stunned behind his own field table, unable to square how fast the whole thing had unraveled after months of dread. When he reached for words of formal reward, a title, a grant of land, anything, Emery waved it all off, citing work waiting back home, and the pair withdrew by wastride before the tent had finished processing what it had just witnessed. Word reached him days later that Marchant was drafting a full honors ceremony in his name, banners, and all. When a courier came looking to deliver the formal summons in person, Emery simply ducked around a stacked crate wall and vanished back into the depot floor's crowd, unbothered, leaving the man to ask 3 different clerks where the founder had gone. Posing as an ordinary traveling clerk, Cora Vale arrived at Yildrest on High Assessor Cassane's orders, sent quietly to expose what the Concord suspected was an illegitimate cult built around Emery's name. She toured the bazaar hall for 2 full days, noting every honest weight and fair price down to the smallest coin, then watched townsfolk quietly leave small thank offerings, a folded ribbon, a jar of preserves, at the assay circle without anyone asking them to. She questioned Garner directly, expecting him to describe coercion or fear, and found none at all in his answers. Petra explained the devotion freely when asked, without a trace of enforced tribute in her voice, calling it simply gratitude that had nowhere else to go. Cora measured all of it against the Concord's own mandatory tithe ledgers back home, thick with penalties and forced quotas, and came away disgusted with her own order's greed instead of Yildrest's supposed corruption. She resolved on the spot to stay, and asked Garner for honest work at a real bench, rather than a courier's wage. Cassane's fury mounted as 2 more dispatched agents went silent in turn, one after another, with no report and no return. She sent her chief enforcer Bram out with a full armored Concord escort to settle the matter personally, certain that where quiet spies had failed, open force would not. Bram's column marched openly on Yildrest's eastern gate at midday and demanded the settlement surrender its ledgers to a full Concord audit. Refused flatly, he ordered the escort to force the gate open. Roswell's Bastion Ward locked the gateway shut around them before a single boot crossed the threshold, and Kelder's repeater rig battery pinned the whole escort in place from the wall above without drawing a single casualty on either side. Boxed in and hopelessly outgunned, they laid down their arms within minutes, and Greta's squad moved in to disarm and bind Bram before he could rally what was left of his nerve. Word of the entirely bloodless rout reached Concord Hall within the day, carried by whichever rider Bram's own officers sent running. Yildrest's staff good-naturedly ribbed Bram over his failed column for a solid week, and Ottilie claimed him for her usual reform rounds without any special ceremony at all, the same treatment she gave every captured enforcer. Days of scrubbing floors, honest ledger work at Garner's side, and blunt truths delivered over shared meals followed, until Bram finally broke down one evening, admitting he had never once actually liked Kassane's tithes, only feared what refusing them would cost him. Satisfied, Ottilie pronounced him fit to carry his own report home, and he rode back to Concord Hall entirely of his own will, no escort required. Bram walked into Kassane's hall unescorted and calm, a changed man by every visible measure, and declared his old loyalty misguided and Yildrest's leadership entirely legitimate. Kassane stared, baffled, as her own chief enforcer, the man she had trusted most, reported the settlement blameless from top to bottom. News soon reached Kassane of an unusually generous donation offer from Yildrest, and greed briefly won out over her better instincts about the timing. A runner burst in moments later, reporting an unexplained disturbance at the gates, and a twinfold clay double of Emery walked calmly into her hall as if he owned the floor beneath him. Kassane ordered her personal guards to seize the intruder at once, but they only exchanged uneasy glances with one another and stayed exactly where they stood. Bram stepped forward and declared his own switched loyalty aloud, plainly, in front of every one of them, and that settled it. Won over completely. The guards turned on Kassane instead of the double, seizing her by the arms and hauling her off to a private holding room inside her own hall. Weeks passed while Ottilie worked through Kassane's reform in strict private. No visitors, no reports back to the Concord. The high assessor who finally emerged was thinner, quieter, and unnervingly courteous. Nothing at all like the woman who had marched her enforcer out to force a gate. She traveled to Osric's restored court to apologize in person, kneeling before the assembled nobles to admit that the Concord's hostility toward Yildrest had been baseless greed all along, nothing more principled than that. She publicly abolished the Concord's mandatory service tithes on the spot, to a hall full of stunned silence. Convinced by the gesture, Osric declared the Concord's reform genuine before his whole court, and Yildrest's own faith practice, offerings and all, was formally recognized as legitimate at last. The registered rolls finally crossed 500,000 souls, a number that would have sounded absurd back at the roadside stall where all of this started. The goods refined tally roared past 4 million entries logged, climbing faster than any clerk could read the totals aloud. The network stepped up into a 6th tier at last, the Sovereign Exchange. At the Assay Circle's heart, Yildrest raised the Sovereign Exchange Hall in a single continuous working, its spire outstripping every structure built before it, and standing visible for miles around in every direction. Before the gathered crowd, Petra climbed the hall's own steps and addressed them all, naming Emery, simply and without ceremony, the hand that makes honest, a title the crowd took up chanting before she had even finished it. After the rout, Malric resolved to sue for peace, rather than lose everything he had spent years building, his officers' reports naming losses he could no longer afford to replace. He dispatched Marshal Dietrich Kane south as his formal envoy, with strict instructions to secure terms, not test them. Kane's convoy rode the crown-chartered wagonway line into Vantry, and he gaped openly at cargo cars outpacing his own army's supply wagons without a single beast pulling them. Passing the Millrace district's levee-tamed river channel, he noted fields once regularly flooded, now feeding a standing surplus. Granaries stacked higher than anything Varaine's own farmland produced in a good year. They reached Yildrest's outer ramparts, bristling with battery after battery of Kelder's repeater rigs mounted along the full length of the wall, and Kane counted more standing defenses here in a single glance than Varaine had managed to field at the border in its entire failed campaign. He was led through the Bazaar Hall's endless stocked colonnades, shelves running deeper than any warehouse he had toured back home, and received formally beneath the Sovereign Exchange Hall's new spire. Kane offered Malric's surrender and lasting peace in careful, formal language, and Emery accepted without hesitation, asking only for open trade and no further raids across the border. Kane departed convinced this nation was now far too strong to challenge again, whatever Malric decided to tell his own court. Splitting himself into several twinfold doubles house to keep pace with everything at once, Emery sent one out to raise bathing pools and timber slides in a string of border towns that had never seen either. Villagers stared baffled as the double tried and badly failed to explain the new quiet soaking room tucked behind the main pool, a plain reserved hour for the tired and aching after a full day's work, nothing more, stammering through a description that only made the whole thing sound stranger than it was. The rural elders eventually declared the strange new amenities harmless enough after watching their own children splash happily in the main pool for a week and let the matter drop entirely. A wind color dropped shrieking out of the clouds toward the barn, wings blotting the last of the daylight. Finch's pack beast bunched defensively at once, horns lowered in a tight ring before it could seize one of them, and a lead ox caught its wing with a solid horn strike that grounded it hard against the fence line. Wounded, but still dangerous, it thrashed free of the splintered rail and took flight again, shrieking louder than before. Wisp arrived at a run, loosing white-fletched arrows from the barn roof, while Emery anchored a bedrock right spike through its trailing foot to hold it in place, and her follow-up shot dropped it clean into the paddock mud. Finch counted the herd afterward and found only bruises and scattered fencing, nothing worse. Rather than left to rot, the carcass was processed methodically for hide and bone, and Finch spent the rest of the evening reinforcing the barn roof against the next aerial try. Emery carved the ridgeline cut, a bedrock right pass driven clean through solid rock in one long working, opening untouched hunting ground, thick with fresh game trails on the far side. Bridget led the first licensed hunting party through the new pass at dawn and dropped a charging ridge elk single-handed before it could close the distance, burying her spear to the haft on the first throw. Even seasoned hunters who had walked far worse ground stood staring at the raw strength behind it. A vast shape darkened the sky above the buried exchange's deepest band, wings blotting out the pale glow that lit the chamber below. Nib's ledger stone flared in dread at the sight. The vault worm had surfaced at last, the ancient hoarder spirit every crew had been warned never to disturb. Every crew pulled back at once as it circled low over the chamber, and Emery stepped forward alone, laying out a spread of finished goods, polished ingots, and sealed cloth bolts, in careful rows rather than drawing a single weapon. Cornered by Yildress ringed defenses on every side, the worm weighed its odds in a long, considering silence and abandoned aggression, accepting the trade over a fight it had no real chance of winning. Its immense form folded inward all at once, scales and coiled bulk collapsing down into a small human shape no taller than Petra. A stone-gray girl stepped out of the settling dust, dry-eyed and unhurried, and named herself Imra. Wary staff ringed the newcomer at once, hands going to tools rather than weapons, until Emery introduced her plainly as Imra, a trade partner from the deep bands. Nothing more alarming than that. Petra, sensing worth again, the way she always had since the assay circle first woke that gift in her, felt an inexplicable pull toward Imra's plain, unpracticed honesty. Emery smoothed the tension himself, vouching for her openly before the gathered crowd, and on impulse, offered her the guest lodge and a standing place among them, the same offer he had made to every stranger who ever proved worth it. Imra studied the ingot he pressed into her hands, turning it slowly over in the lamplight with quiet wonder, running one thumb along its polished edge. She admitted plainly that no one had ever offered her anything freely before, not once in all the ages she could remember. The crowd's wariness softened at that, won over by her plain astonishment far more than by anything Emery had said on her behalf. Garner quietly added her name to Yildress household roles before the night was out, and Fenlo ambled over grinning, delighted to no longer be the strangest resident anyone had to explain to newcomers. Petra and Greta's rivalry, never short of a target for long, found a fresh and good-natured one in her within the hour. Evening settled fully over Yildress.